The first thing he felt was pain in his wrists. The rope had cut so deeply into his skin that it felt as if his hands would fall off on their own at any moment. Then came the smell. Smoke, moss, unwashed bodies, and something else, something familiar. Ethan Reed opened his eyes and saw the fire right below him. He was hanging upside down over the bonfire. Blood was pounding in his temples, and the world before his eyes swam with red spots. 12 creatures stood around the bonfire. No, not creatures, people. But he had never seen people like this in his life. Black teeth, sunken cheeks, skin as gray as ash. And their eyes. There was no malice in their eyes. There was a plea in their eyes. A woman with chapped lips stood closest to him. She held a knife in her right hand. Her left hand was shaking so violently that Ethan could hear her rings clinking against one another. She was whispering something. He listened closely. She was whispering an apology. She was asking him for forgiveness before she killed him. Standing next to the woman was a girl of about 5. The girl stared intently at the knife. Not at Ethan, at the knife. She knew what was about to happen. She'd seen it before. And at that moment, a transparent panel flashed before Ethan's eyes. The letters glowed with a soft golden light right in the air. The hearth system is activated. Trust, 0 out of 100. First mission, survive this night without killing any of them. Ethan blinked. The panel didn't disappear. He blinked again. The panel remained. All right, he'd gone crazy. Or died. Or died and gone crazy at the same time. The last thing he remembered from his previous life was the smell of burning wood and a calculator on the kitchen table. And now he was hanging upside down over a campfire with some kind of game panel glowing in front of him. Great. Just wonderful. The woman with the knife took a step forward. Ethan looked at her, then at the girl, then back at the woman. And that's when he realized it. He recognized that smell. It wasn't smoke or moss. It was fear. Pure animal fear. He'd sensed it 1,000 times in his own kitchen when a young apprentice knew he was about to mess everything up. When his hands would shake and the knife would tremble, not out of anger, but out of horror at what he was about to do. This woman didn't want to cut him. She was forcing herself to do it, and the little girl standing next to her was the reason. Ethan figured it all out in 3 seconds. Mother, a hungry child, a knife. No choice. Either she cuts him or the child goes hungry. Either the child goes hungry or the mother cuts someone else. Someone closer. Someone from her own family. He had maybe 40 seconds, maybe 30. He saw the woman grip the knife more firmly. He saw her lips pressed together into a thin line. He saw her stop whispering apologies. That meant she'd made up her mind. Ethan took a deep breath and spoke. His voice was hoarse from the smoke and from all the blood rushing to his head. He asked her name. Not a cannibal, not a beast, not a monster. What was her name before she became a mother who cuts people up to feed her daughter? The woman froze. The knife stopped 3 centimeters from his throat. The silence was so thick that Ethan could hear the fire crackling beneath him and the girl's heart beating beside him. The woman opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, and said one word. Nora. The panel flashed. The first name was recorded. Ethan said to her calmly and evenly, Nora, untie one of my hands. Not both, just one. And give me that pot over there. Water. And any root you usually throw away. In 10 minutes, your daughter will eat something that isn't human. If it doesn't work, just cut him. He won't even flinch. Nora looked at him. 1 second. 2. 3. Then she turned to the girl. The girl was looking at Ethan, not at the knife. For the first time all evening, she wasn't looking at the knife, but at the man hanging upside down, talking to her mother as if they were standing in line for bread. Nora cut the rope on his left arm. Just the left one. Ethan hung crookedly by one arm, and the pain in his shoulder made his vision go dark. But he gritted his teeth and reached down with his free hand. "Give me the pot." Someone in the crowd shoved a crumpled iron pot toward him. Someone splashed water from a wineskin. An old man with a sun-scorched face tossed a bundle of roots toward his hand. With one hand, Ethan trimmed off the tops. With one hand, he tossed the roots into the water. With one hand, he moved the pot closer to the fire where they were about to roast it. The panel flashed again. Hearth recipe activated. Ingredient: wild burdock root. Status: suitable. Potential: if prepared for a specific person, it can replace one serving of cursed food for 4 hours. Ethan almost laughed. 4 hours. A whole 4 hours. That was more than nothing. It was infinitely more than nothing. The roots boiled for 7 minutes. Ethan counted every second. At the 4-minute mark, the panel displayed a new message. The home shelf lottery has been unlocked. First prize: salt, 12 grams. Ethan felt something appear in his clenched fist. He unclenched his fingers. A pinch of white crystals lay in his palm. Salt. Ordinary table salt. He almost cried. 12 grams of salt is almost nothing. It's not even a teaspoon. But for burdock root boiled in plain water, it was the difference between slop and a meal. He tossed the salt into the pot. He stirred the roots with his finger because he didn't have a spoon. At the 9-minute mark, he pulled the pot off the heat. At the 10-minute mark, he handed it to the girl. Not to Nora, to the girl. He looked her in the eyes and said it was for her. Just for her. He asked her name. The girl looked at her mother. Nora nodded. The girl said quietly, "Marin." Ethan repeated, "Marin. It's delicious. Try some." Marin took the pot with both hands. She brought it to her lips. She took a sip. And her eyes went wide. She took another sip. And another. And another. She drank greedily and quickly, burning her lips and not stopping. Nora watched this, and the knife in her hand slowly dropped, centimeter by centimeter, until it fell to the ground. The panel flashed gold. Nora's trust went from 0 to 34. Marin's curse went from 100% to 99.2%. Ethan hung by one arm over the bonfire. His shoulder was ablaze. Blood was pounding in his head. 12 cannibals were staring at him, and he was staring back at them. And somewhere deep within his tortured, twisted mind, the head chef's little voice said, "Well, there you go. First order accepted. 62 to go." The old man with the scorched face stepped closer. He looked at the empty pot in Marin's hands, then at Ethan, then back at the pot. He said that Ethan didn't understand what he'd done. Now the girl would want more, and tomorrow she wouldn't get it. And the day after tomorrow, the curse would strike her twice as hard. And then Marin wouldn't eat the root. Marin would eat him, the old man, because that's how the curse works. Ethan looked at the old man. He asked his name. The old man was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Born." Ethan nodded as much as he could while hanging upside down and said that Born was right. One bowl wasn't enough. So tomorrow there would be a second, and the day after tomorrow a third, and in a week the 10th. But for that to happen, he'd have to be taken down from this fire, because while he could certainly cook while hanging upside down, the result would be much worse. Bourne stared at him for a long time. Then he turned to the others. No one moved. Nora picked up the knife from the ground. Ethan felt his heart stop for a second. Nora walked over to him and cut the second rope. He collapsed face first into the mud next to the fire. His whole body was on fire. His hands wouldn't obey him. His vision was blurring. But he was alive. The panel flashed one last time before he sank into darkness. Mission accomplished. Survive this night without killing a single one of them. Reward. The Who Needs It feature will be available starting at dawn today. Ethan lay in the mud near the bonfire where they were about to burn him. 12 cannibals stood around him. A 5-year-old girl was finishing a bowl of boiled burdock root with a pinch of salt, and it was the best dinner he had ever prepared in either of his lives. Ethan woke up to a scream, not a human scream, a bestial one, a hoarse, ragged howl coming from the hut 3 walls away from him. He was lying on the dirt floor of some kind of shed. His arms were free but wouldn't obey him. His shoulder was swollen, and every movement sent a dull ache from his neck to his lower back. The howl rang out again from behind the wall. Then a crash. Then someone's voice. Then the sound of a blow. Ethan stood up. He was unsteady on his feet. A panel flashed before his eyes. Who needs this today? A list of 6 lines. Marin, 5 years. Curse 99.2%. Haven't slept all night. Afraid that yesterday's taste was just a dream. Born, 61 years old. 100% curse. 3 nights without sleep. Thinks it's his turn to go mad. Nora, 27 years old. 100% curse. Haven't eaten in 2 days. Gave her ration to her daughter. Ren, 34 years old. 100% cursed. 2nd day of withdrawal. On the verge of a breakdown. Gray, 22 years old. 100% cursed. 3rd day of withdrawal. Dangerous. Fira, 41 years old. 100% cursed. 1st day of withdrawal. She hides her hands because her fingernails have already turned black. Ethan read the list twice. 3 people going through withdrawal. 3 people who, right now, were going mad with hunger because their bodies would accept nothing but human flesh. And yesterday he fed a child a burdock root. 1 child, 1 plateful, and decided he was a hero. The howling outside the wall grew louder. Ethan stepped out of the shed. Early morning, gray light barely filtered through the treetops. Mossy Hollow looked exactly as its name suggested. Moss on every rock, moss on every wall, moss on the roofs of the huts. The village lay in a hollow between 2 hills covered in black forest. 12 huts, a goat pen with no goats in it, a well with murky water, and a clearing in the center with that very fire pit where he had been hanging yesterday. Ethan counted about 20 people. Women and children huddled against the walls. 3 men stood at the entrance to the farthest hut. A howl came from inside the hut. Ethan headed toward it. Bourne intercepted him halfway there. The old man grabbed him by the elbow and said he couldn't go in there. Gray was inside. Gray was on his 3rd day. Words alone couldn't stop him now. Ethan asked what happened when someone reached the 3rd day. Bourne looked at him the way you look at a child who asks why the sky is blue in the middle of a fire. He said that on the 3rd day, the cursed one stops recognizing faces. Everyone around him becomes meat. Just meat. And he lunges at the nearest person. Usually the one he loves most of all, because he senses his loved ones by their scent first. Gray had a wife, Fira, the very woman on the list. Withdrawal on the 1st day. He hides his hands because his fingernails have already turned black. Ethan looked at the hut from which the howling was coming, then at Bourne. He asked if there was any meat. Any meat. Not human. Bourne shook his head. The huntress had left at dawn. She'd be back by noon if they were lucky. Ethan closed his eyes. The panel showed him the contents of his pockets. Nothing. 0. He had no ingredients, no tools, and no cookware. Just a crumpled pot from last night, and the memory that the lottery runs once a day if at least one person raises their trust by 10 points that day. Yesterday, Nora raised her trust by 34. The lottery should trigger again today. But for that to happen, he'd have to wait until nightfall, and Gray wouldn't make it until nightfall. Ethan opened his eyes. He asked Bourne what grew around the village. Bourne listed them off. Moss, ferns, burdock, nettles, wild sorrel. Mushrooms, but half of them are poisonous. Berries, but they're bitter and make you throw up. Ethan nodded. He asked someone to bring him nettles, lots of nettles, and sorrel, and any mushrooms that don't kill you right away. And stones. Flat stones the size of a palm. Bourne looked at him as if he were crazy, but he nodded to two women and they went into the forest. Ethan approached Gray's hut. The howling grew quieter. That was worse. A quiet howl meant Gray was gathering his strength. Ethan placed his hand on the door and activated the hearth recipe. The panel showed him that the door was an oak plank, not an ingredient. He removed his hand. He looked around. He picked up a tuft of moss from the ground. He placed his hand on it. The panel. Ingredient: sphagnum moss. Condition: fresh. Potential: antiseptic when applied topically. Nutritional value: 0. Not suitable for hearth recipes. Ethan cursed, quietly, to himself, in a language no one here knew. The women returned 20 minutes later with armfuls of stinging nettles and sorrel. There turned out to be 3 types of mushrooms. Ethan placed his hand on each one. First type, poisonous. Second type, conditionally edible, safe if cooked for a long time. Nutritional value is minimal. Third type. The panel lingered a second longer than usual. Horned mushroom. Condition: fresh. Potential: when prepared for a specific person, it suppresses bouts of starvation for 2 hours. Effectiveness depends on the cook's level of trust in the eater. Ethan squeezed the mushroom in his hand. 2 hours. If he prepares it correctly and for a specific person. Not for everyone. For one. But 3 are going through withdrawal. 3 people who need this plate right now. And he can only cook for 1 at a time. If he makes a single stew for all 3, the system will shut down for a day. And the curse will strike twice as hard. The rules were cruel and simple. 1 person, 1 plate, 1 name. Ethan looked at Gray's hut, then at Fira, who was standing by the wall, hiding her hands with black nails under a rag. Then at Ren. Ren was sitting on the ground, rocking back and forth. His eyes were glassy. The second day of withdrawal. He had about 8 hours left until the 3rd day. Gray was on his 3rd day. Gray was the most dangerous of them all. But the system demanded trust, and Gray didn't know Ethan's name. Gray didn't know Ethan existed. Right now, Gray knew nothing at all except hunger. Ethan made a decision. He would cook for Ren. Not because Ren was more important, but because Ren still had eyes that could see faces. He could still accept a plate from a person's hands. He could still hear his own name. Ethan sat down on the ground next to the fire pit. He laid out the nettles, sorrel, horned mushrooms. He found yesterday's pot. He drew water from the well, and he began to cook. He remembered that the panel had shown only 1 line about Ren that morning. Ren, 34 years old, 2nd day of withdrawal, on the verge of a breakdown. That wasn't enough. Ethan turned to Bourne. He asked who Ren was. Bourne paused. Then he said, Ren was a carpenter. The only one in the village. He built huts for everyone. 3 years ago, he built a cradle for Hannah's baby. A week later, Hannah's husband ate that baby. Ren hasn't built a single cradle since then. Ethan listened. Go on. Bourne said that Ren had a habit. When he felt bad, he carved little figures out of wood. Animals, horses, birds. He gives them to the children. The kids break them within a day, but he carves new ones. New ones every time. Ethan felt something shift inside him. A man who carves wooden horses for other people's children because he no longer builds cradles for his own. Ethan placed his hand on the nettles. The panel changed. Usually it just displayed the ingredients' properties, but now a new line appeared. A recipe for Ren. Nettle broth with horn mushrooms and sorrel. Serve in a bowl with the name scratched into it. Effect: suppresses an attack for 3 hours instead of 2. Bonus for personalization. Trust +1 for every detail the cook knows about the diner. Ethan began cooking. He scalded the nettles with boiling water twice to remove the sting. He tore the sorrel into small pieces by hand. He sliced the mushrooms thinly. He worked with one hand because, after yesterday's suspension, his other hand was only working intermittently. When the broth came to a boil, he took the pot off the fire. He found a sharp stone. He picked up a flat stone and scratched a single word into it. Wren. He poured the broth onto the stone as if it were a plate. He walked over to Wren. Wren was sitting on the ground, rocking back and forth. His eyes were glassy. His hands were clenched into fists. Ethan sat down beside him. He said quietly, "Wren, I know you've been whittling horses for the kids. I know you haven't built a cradle in 3 years. I don't know if this can be fixed, but I made this for you. Just for you. Your name is on the stone. Take it." Wren turned his head, slowly. His eyes were still glassy. But he looked down, at the stone, at his name scratched into the stone. His hands unclenched. He took the stone in both hands like a child accepting a gift, and he began to drink, slowly, sip by sip. With each sip, the tremor in his hands lessened. Panel. Wren's trust went from 0 to 14. Curse weakening, 0.4%. The fit has been suppressed for 3 hours. Ethan exhaled. 1 down, 2 to go. And he had neither mushrooms nor time. Gray was howling in the hut. Fira stood by the wall, her fingernails turning black before his eyes. Ethan turned to Bourne. He asked how many horn mushrooms grew in the forest. Bourne said there were many, but they had to be gathered 2 hours' walk from the village. Ethan looked at the sun. Morning, maybe 7 o'clock. It was Fira's first day of withdrawal. She had until tomorrow morning. Gray had no time. Gray was already past the point of no return. At that moment, the door to Gray's cabin burst into splinters. He ran outside. Healthy, broad-shouldered. His eyes were completely empty, white, without pupils. He looked at the crowd in front of him and saw not faces but flesh. The women screamed. Someone snatched up the children. Bourne stepped back. Wren leaped to his feet. Gray turned his head at the sound of a scream and lunged forward, toward the woman holding a child, toward Nora, toward Marin. Ethan didn't think. He stepped between them, right in Gray's path. Gray crashed into him like a wall. No! Ethan crashed to the ground like a rag doll. Gray weighed twice as much and was out of his mind. Ethan was sent flying 3 meters and slammed his back against a pole. His mouth tasted salty. Gray turned toward him, stopped, sniffed the air. Ethan lay on the ground, smelling of nettle broth and mushrooms. Gray froze. Something flashed in his empty white eyes. Not recognition, confusion. He sensed food. Not human flesh, something else. Something he'd never sensed before, and it was throwing him off. Ethan took advantage of that split second. He shouted without getting up from the ground. "Shadow!" He didn't know why he said that. He didn't know the huntress's real name. He only knew her nickname. The arrow plunged into the ground a centimeter from Gray's foot. The huntress stood on the roof of the nearest hut, holding a bow. She wasn't aiming at Gray. She was aiming at the ground in front of him. A warning. Gray looked at the arrow. He looked at the roof. He looked at Ethan. And he collapsed to his knees. He was shaking. His eyes slowly changed from white to normal, cloudy, sickly, but human. He looked at his hands and whimpered. He realized what he had nearly done. The panel flashed. The crisis had passed. Gray, a 6-hour setback. Next episode in 6 hours. Gray's trust in Ethan, 0. Ethan lay on the ground. His back was on fire. Blood filled his mouth. Standing over him was a huntress with her bow aimed at his forehead. She said one sentence. If he risked their lives one more time, she would shoot him herself. Ethan looked up at her. He spat out the blood. Then he asked how many deer she'd brought. The huntress was silent for 3 seconds. Then she said, 1. Ethan nodded. That would be enough for 3 individual plates if stretched out. Help me up. The huntress didn't help. She turned and walked away. But the deer lay by the village gate, skinned, gutted, and prepared. She'd brought it before dawn and had been waiting on the roof. Ethan understood. She hadn't come to threaten him, she'd come to help. She just didn't know any other way. Ethan was butchering a deer in the town square in front of the whole village. His hands were covered in blood up to his elbows, and he caught himself thinking that 3 days ago his hands had been covered in blood up to his elbows from filleting salmon at a 12-table restaurant. The difference was that the salmon hadn't been staring at him with 60 pairs of hungry eyes. The deer wasn't large, 30 kilograms of lean meat. For 63 people, that was laughable. 400 grams each if divided equally. But Ethan wasn't going to divide it equally. He wasn't going to divide it at all. The system forbade cooking for everyone at once. 1 plate, 1 name, 1 story. He divided the meat into 3 portions. The first for Gray. He had 6 hours left. The second for Fira, her first day of withdrawal. The third for Nora, who hadn't eaten in 2 days. Bourne stepped forward and asked, "What about the rest?" Ethan said the rest would get theirs tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and the week after that. But today, these 3 would either die or relapse, and then everyone would die. Bourne clenched his jaw. Ethan could see that the old man wanted to argue. He wanted to say that it wasn't fair, that there were children who hadn't eaten in 3 days, that there were women who gave their rations to their husbands so they wouldn't relapse. But Bourne said nothing. Because Bourne had lived in this village for 61 years and knew better than anyone that justice had died here 300 years ago. Ethan started with Fira. He walked over to her. She was standing by the wall of her hut, hiding her hands. The nails on both hands were black and long. They were starting to curl, the first sign that the curse was taking over her body. Ethan sat down next to her, not too close, at arm's length. He asked her name, even though he already knew it from the panel. It was important to him that she say it out loud herself. Fira looked at him with a glazed stare. She said he was the one from the cauldron. Ethan nodded. The one from the cauldron. Fira said he was wasting his time. She could already feel her claws growing. By tomorrow evening, she'd be just like Gray. And then it would be better if Shadow just shot her right away. Ethan didn't argue. He asked who she had been before she stopped being herself. Fira was silent for a long time. Then she said she used to knit. She knew how to knit with sinews and tendons. She made ropes, nets, clothes. Once she knitted a blanket for Nora's daughter, for Marin. From wool they'd haggled for from border merchants at an exorbitant price. Marin still sleeps under that blanket. Ethan remembered. The knitter, the blanket for Marin. Hands that created rather than destroyed. He returned to the campfire. He placed his hand on a piece of venison, a recipe card, a recipe for Fira. Braised venison with wild sorrel, to be served wrapped in burdock tied with a sinew cord. Like a bundle, like a gift. Effect: suppression of an attack for 8 hours, nail retraction, bonus for personalization, presented as a bundle, +2 to trust. Ethan cooked for 40 minutes. He chopped the venison finely. He braised it in its own juices with sorrel over low heat. He wrapped it in a burdock leaf, tied it with a tendon. It turned out to be a neat bundle, similar to the ones Fira knitted herself. He brought it to her, placed it on her lap, said it was for her, just for her. Fira unwrapped the bundle. She looked at the meat inside. She sniffed it. Her face twitched. She picked up the first piece with her black fingers and put it in her mouth. She chewed slowly. She closed her eyes. And Ethan saw how the nails on her right hand began to lighten, from black to dark gray, barely noticeable. But they had begun. The panel. Fira's trust went from 0 to 12. The episode was suppressed for 8 hours. Fira's curse went from 100% to 99.6. 2 dishes were ready. 1 remained. The most important one. Gray. Ethan looked at the hut. Gray was sitting inside. After the breakdown, He'd curled up in a corner and hadn't come out. His wife, Fira, had just eaten her portion. She was already starting to come to her senses. But Gray didn't know that. Gray didn't know anything at all. Ethan took the second piece of venison. He placed his hand on it. The panel. The recipe for Gray. Venison on the bone, roasted on a stone, minimal preparation. Serve on a flat stone without dishes. Effect: suppresses a seizure for 4 hours. Weak. Reason: trust 0. The chef knows nothing about Gray except his name. Ethan frowned. 4 hours? That's not enough. In 4 hours, Gray will have another episode, and next time, Son A's arrow might not be a warning. He needed to know more. He turned to Fira. He asked about Gray. Fira looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Gray collected stones, beautiful stones, smooth ones, colored ones, river stones. He has a whole collection under his bed." He found every stone for her. For Fira. He'd bring them and place them next to her pillow in the mornings while she slept. 247 stones over 10 years. Fira knew the exact number. Ethan felt his throat tighten. A man who had spent 10 years collecting pebbles for his wife and placing them by her pillow in the mornings. And now he's sitting in a dark hut, howling because his body demands to devour that very same wife. Ethan found a smooth stone in a dried-up stream, white with a gray streak. He placed the venison on it. Not on a flat cooking stone, on a beautiful stone. He seared the meat on a second stone heated in the fire, transferred it to the white one, carried it to the hut. He went inside. It was dark and stank inside. Gray was sitting in the corner. He had his arms wrapped around his knees. He was rocking back and forth. His eyes were closed. Ethan sat down on the floor. He said quietly, "Gray, I know about the stones. 247 of them, every morning by her pillow. I found another one for you, a white one with a gray streak. It's right in front of you now. There's meat on it. Venison. Not human. Eat it. And then take the stone to fire. She's waiting." Silence. Then Gray opened his eyes. Cloudy. Red. But not white. Not empty. He looked down. At the stone. At the meat. At the white stone with a gray streak. His hand reached forward, trembling. He took the meat, brought it to his mouth, bit into it, chewed, swallowed. His shoulders shook. He ate and cried at the same time. Panel. Gray's trust 0 became 11. The episode suppressed for 6 hours. Not 4, 6. Bonus for the stone. Bonus for knowing the story. Gray's curse 100 became 99.5%. Ethan stepped out of the hut. The sun was high in the sky. Noon. He'd prepared 3 plates in a single morning. 3 people had stopped going mad for a few hours, and he felt as if he'd run a marathon through the kitchen on New Year's Eve. His body ached. His shoulder throbbed. His back, after Gray's blow, wouldn't straighten all the way. He sat down on the ground by the fire and closed his eyes. The panel flickered quietly. Village Trust, 71. It takes 100 points to reduce one resident's curse by 1%. 29 points remaining. Lottery available. Ethan opened the lottery. Today's prize? Yeast, 40 grams. He unclenched his fist. A small beige lump lay in his palm. Yeast, 40 grams. In his past life, he'd tossed packs like this into the trash without a second thought. Here, it was a treasure. Because yeast is bread, and bread is food that doesn't require meat. There was 1 plate left, for Nora. Ethan looked around. Nora was sitting by the wall of the hut with Marin on her lap. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, but she didn't ask. She didn't come over. She didn't remind him. She just sat there and waited. Ethan walked over. He sat down next to her. The third piece of venison lay in the pot. He placed his hand on it. Panel. Recipe for Nora. Braised venison with nettles. Serve in the pot Marin ate from yesterday. Effect. Suppresses an attack for 10 hours. Bonus. Mother-daughter bond. The same pot. Ethan prepared it. In silence. Nora watched his hands, at the way he cut the meat, the way he stirred in the nettles, the way he tasted the broth with his fingertip. She said he cooked as if he were talking to the food. Ethan didn't answer. He handed her the pot. That very one. The one from which Marin had drunk burdock root yesterday. Nora took it. She looked inside. She looked at her daughter. Marin reached for the pot. Nora pulled her hand away. She said it was Mommy's. For the first time in a long time, she said that word. Mommy's. She didn't give it away. She didn't share it. She kept it for herself. Because if her mother died of starvation, her daughter would have no one to protect her. Nora ate slowly. Every bite was like a small victory. Marin watched her and smiled. Nora looked up at Ethan over the rim of the pot. There was something in her gaze that he hadn't seen yesterday. Yesterday there had been fear and despair and a faint glimmer of hope. Today there was something else. Something resembling respect. Nora's trust 34 became 47. Nora's curse 100 became 99.1. Total village trust 100. Threshold crossed. Reducing one villager's curse by 1% is now available. Select a villager. Ethan didn't hesitate for a second. Marin. Marin's curse went from 99.2 to 98.2%. Ethan looked at the number. 98.2. Far, infinitely far from zero, but closer than yesterday. He lay down on the ground right by the fire. He closed his eyes. He needed to sleep for at least an hour. In 6 hours, Gray would start howling again. In 8 hours, Fira would feel her nails turning black again. In 10, Nora would get hungry again, and he was out of venison. But he had yeast, 40 grams, and that meant that tomorrow, for the first time in 300 years, someone in this village would bake bread. The bread turned out terrible. Ethan stared at the gray flatbread on the stone, and his inner chef wanted to die all over again. No butter, no eggs, no decent flour. He'd ground the wild grains between 2 stones and ended up with a coarse grind that looked more like sand than flour. The yeast worked, but the dough rose unevenly. Baking over an open fire without an oven meant that one side burned while the other remained raw. But it was bread. For the first time in 300 years, the smell of bread filled Mossy Hollow. Marin woke up to the scent. She stepped out of the hut and stood barefoot on the wet ground. She looked at the flatbread on the stone. She didn't know what it was. She had never seen bread in her life. Ethan broke off a piece. He placed his hand on it. Panel. Recipe for Marin. Flatbread. Wild grain. Yeast. Effect. Replaces 1 serving of cursed food for 6 hours. Bonus. The eater's first bread ever. +3 to trust. He held out the piece to Marin. The girl took it. She took a bite. Her face scrunched up. Then it smoothed out. She chewed slowly, intently, and said one word. Delicious. Ethan knew that wasn't true. The flatbread was hard, slightly bitter, and undercooked. But for a child who had eaten nothing but this her whole life, it was a miracle. The panel. Marin's trust went from 30 to 41. Marin's curse went from 98.2 to 97.8. Morning of the 3rd day. Ethan sat by the fire and watched the village wake up. 3 days ago, he had been hanging upside down over this very fire. Now, people were standing around the fire, expecting a miracle from him, and he had to deliver it. The panel displayed the morning list. 12 names. 4 were experiencing withdrawal. For 6, the curse was approaching a critical point. For 2, Everything was stable. Relatively stable for people who can't eat anything but human flesh. Ethan started the day with his rounds. He went from hut to hut and talked. He didn't cook. He talked. He went in and asked for their names. He asked who they used to be, what they could do, what good things they remembered. Most of them looked at him as if he were crazy. Some didn't answer. 2 tried to hit him. One old man spat in his face and said he didn't need a dead man's pity. Ethan wiped his face and moved on. By the 10th house, he knew 18 names, 18 stories, 18 broken lives. A cloth merchant condemned for a debt that didn't exist. A baker's widow exiled for refusing a lord. A former soldier who lost a leg in the war and became useless. The daughter of a herbalist accused of witchcraft. None of them ended up here because they were monsters. They became monsters because they ended up here. The curse didn't discriminate. It simply was. Like mold on the walls, like moss on the stones. You're born in Loshina and your stomach accepts nothing but human flesh. A simple mechanism of evil that had been working for 300 years without fail. By noon, Ethan knew 23 names out of 63. The panel refreshed. Village trust level 128. Lottery available. Prize, a cast iron skillet. Ethan felt his knees buckle. A skillet. A real skillet. He grabbed it with both hands and pressed it to his chest. Heavy. Rough. Perfect. With this skillet, he could fry things. Not just cook in a pot. Fry. Mushrooms, roots, meat, if there was any. Flatbreads would turn out smoother, faster, better. He almost kissed it, but remembered just in time that 20 people were watching him. Claire showed up toward evening. Ethan sensed her before he saw her. She smelled different. Not like moss or sweat, like soap. Cheap church soap, the kind he wouldn't have recognized in his past life. But in Loshina, any scent other than dirt was like a siren. She was standing at the edge of the village, thin, fair-haired, in a gray cassock. Her hands were folded across her chest. Her eyes were large and wary. She looked at the village the way a scientist looks at an experiment, with both interest and caution. Bourne said she'd been here for a month. She'd come alone. She called herself a pilgrim. She wasn't frightened when she found out they were cannibals. She didn't run away. She didn't start praying or cursing. She simply asked if she could stay. Bourne allowed it because she refused to curse them. She was the first outsider in many years who hadn't called them monsters. Ethan approached her. He introduced himself. He said he was a cook. Claire looked at him closely, too closely. She said he didn't look like a convict. Ethan replied that convicts come in all kinds. She said his hands smelled of yeast, and there had never been yeast in the hollow. Ethan said nothing. Claire smiled, for the first time. It was the smile of someone who knows they're facing a mystery and likes it. She said she'd seen him cooking that morning. She'd seen him signing the stones with names. She'd seen the panel flash gold after every plate. Ethan went cold. She'd seen the panel. No one but him could see the panel. Claire said she hadn't seen the panel itself, but she'd seen his eyes focus on something invisible every time. And after that, he'd changed the recipe, every single time, as if he were getting a hint. She was a former novice of the Church of Light. She knew what people who received divine revelations looked like. Ethan didn't receive revelations, but he didn't argue. He asked why she had left the church. Claire fell silent for a long time. Then she said she had seen her mentor burn a pregnant woman alive, a woman who had been declared a heretic, and call it an act of mercy. Claire hadn't been able to pray since then. Not because she had stopped believing, but because she didn't know who her church was praying to now. Ethan listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer comfort. He just listened. When she finished, he asked if she knew how to bake bread. Claire blinked. Then she laughed, briefly and in surprise. She said they'd been taught how at the convent. Ethan handed her a frying pan and the leftover wild grain. He said he needed a helper, someone to grind the grain and knead the dough while he prepared the plates. Claire took the frying pan. She turned it over in her hands. She looked at Ethan and said she'd help. But in return, she wanted to know who he really was. Ethan replied that he'd tell her, someday, if they both lived to see it. Panel. Claire's trust went from 15 to 22. Evening came quickly. Ethan stood by the fire with the frying pan and a small pot. Behind him, Claire was kneading dough from wild grain. Bourne sat on a rock and counted the people. Nora was feeding Marin the leftovers from that morning's flatbread. Wren was carving a wooden horse with the knife Nora had given him. Fira sat next to Gray's hut. Her nails were gray. Not black. Gray. Gray was sleeping inside. The 6 hours until his next seizure had turned into 8. A stone with a gray streak lay under his pillow. Fira had seen it when she went in to check on him. 12 huts, 63 people, 300 years of the curse. And one cook with a cast-iron skillet and a handful of yeast. Ethan stared at the fire and thought about the numbers. 23 names out of 63. Total trust, 128. It takes 10,000 points to completely lift the curse on one person. Per person. 63 people. That's 630,000 points. At his current pace, it would take him several years. But he had 90 days. No, not 90. He didn't know it yet, but there was much less time left before the Order of Ash arrived. He knew only one thing. Tomorrow morning, the panel would show him a new list. New names, new pains, new recipes. And he'd have to prepare every plate as if a life depended on it. Because a life did depend on it. Hannah came to him before he went to sleep. He didn't know her name yet. He only knew that she was huge. A head taller than him, broader in the shoulders, hands like a blacksmith's, because she was a blacksmith. She walked over and silently tossed a leather apron onto his lap. Rough, burned through in 3 places, smelling of iron and sweat. Ethan looked at the apron, then at her. She said that a cook without an apron isn't a cook, he's a clown. And she left. Ethan put on the apron. It was 3 sizes too big for him, but it was the first gift he'd received in this world. A panel. Hannah's trust went from 10 to 16. Ethan lay on the dirt floor of the barn in a stranger's apron with a cast-iron skillet by his side, listening to the village fall asleep. Somewhere, a child was crying quietly. Somewhere, a tree was creaking. Somewhere, Bourne was muttering the names of the dead. Ethan closed his eyes and, for the first time in 3 days, thought about what might be. Just maybe. He wasn't here by accident. By the 10th day, Ethan knew all 63 names. Every morning, the panel showed in the list who needed it today, who was on the brink, and who could wait. And every morning, he got up before dawn and began preparing the food. Son A brought game every other day, deer, wild boars, and twice hares. She didn't speak to him. She'd just leave the carcass by the fire and walk away. Ethan noticed that each time, the carcass was butchered a little more neatly. By the 3rd time, the meat had already been separated from the bones. By the 5th time, bundles of herbs she'd found in the forest lay next to the meat. She didn't speak. She just did. On the 6th day, Ethan made her breakfast. Not just any breakfast. He'd spent 3 hours preparing it, using all the clues he'd gathered over the week. Bourne had once mentioned that Sana had a twin brother. Nora had said that her brother loved fried mushrooms in the morning. He'd gather them himself and fry them on a stone for his sister. Every morning. Until he went mad on the 3rd day of withdrawal. Sana shot him herself. She hadn't eaten since then. 40 days. She drank only herbal teas. She was slowly dying of exhaustion. Ethan found the same mushrooms, horn mushrooms, the very ones he'd used to save Renna. He sliced them thinly. He fried them in a cast-iron skillet. He added wild garlic that Claire had found by the stream. He spread them out on a wide burdock leaf. He placed a sprig of mint next to them. Bourne said that Sana's brother always put mint next to the mushrooms. Not in the mushrooms, next to them, as a garnish. Ethan came to her at dawn. She was sitting on the roof of her hut with an onion on her lap. She was looking at the forest. He placed the leaf with the mushrooms on the edge of the roof and said it was breakfast. Not from him, from the one who used to cook for her every morning. He had simply followed the recipe. Son-Ah looked down, at the mushrooms, at the mint beside them, at how the slices were cut, thinly, just like her brother used to cut them. Her hands froze on the bow. She didn't move for a long time. Ethan stood below and waited. He didn't pressure her. He didn't try to persuade her. He just stood there. Son-Ah picked up one mushroom, brought it to her mouth, placed it on her tongue, closed her eyes, and Ethan saw a single tear roll down her cheek. Just one. She swallowed the mushroom. Took a second. A third. She ate in silence. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. When the plate was empty, she looked up at Ethan and said 2 words. "My name." Ethan waited. She said, "Son-Ah." Not shadow. Son-Ah. Panel. Son-Ah. Trust 5 became 22. Son-Ah curse 100 became 99.1. Unlocked recipe. Breakfast of the Departed. Effect. Removes the refusal to eat in any villager experiencing a loss. Lasts 24 hours. Ethan felt his hands tremble. Not from the cold, from the fact that he had just restored a person's ability to eat through the memory of his dead brother. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time. On the 10th day, 5 villagers ate his food for the first time in their lives without human flesh. The village's overall trust grew every day. The panel displayed numbers: 128, 156, 189, 220. Every day he chose one person to weaken the curse. Marin. Always Marin. Her curse was fading bit by bit. 97. 96. 95. Slowly, but it was fading. On the 11th day, Ethan sat by the fire and taught Marin how to mold figures out of dough. He kneaded the leftover wild grain into a dough thicker than necessary. The dough wasn't suitable for bread, but it was good for molding. Marin sat on his lap and kneaded a piece of dough with her little fingers. She was trying to mold a little horse. It turned out looking more like a potato with legs, but she was focused and serious, like a surgeon. Nora stood by the wall of the hut and watched. She didn't come over. She didn't interfere. She just watched. And on her face was an expression Ethan had seen on the faces of mothers in his restaurant when their children tried something new for the first time. A mixture of fear and hope. Fear that they wouldn't like it. Hope that they would. Claire sat next to Ethan and read aloud from a worn notebook. A monastery recipe for sourdough bread. No yeast, just water and flour. You have to wait 3 days for the sourdough starter to kick in. Ethan listened while watching Marin sculpt her potato horse, all the while thinking that he needed to find a source of grain because their supply of wild grains was running out. Hannah appeared from the other side of the campfire. She sat down on a rock. She pulled a wooden spoon she'd carved herself from behind her belt. She tossed it to Ethan. She said that a cook without a spoon is worse than a cook without an apron, and she neighed so loudly that Marin dropped her figurine. Then she picked it up and continued sculpting. She was used to it. Everyone was used to Hannah neighing like a horse. It was a normal evening, the first normal evening in Mossy Hollow in 300 years. The panel. The village's overall trust level, 312. The lottery. Tomato seeds. A little bag from another world. Ethan tucked the seeds into his shirt and thought that if he survived another 2 months, the village would have tomatoes. If he survived. At that moment, a sound came from the forest, low and drawn out. A horn. A hunting horn. Suna jumped to her feet, bow in hand in a second, arrow on the string. Born raised his head. His face turned gray. He said one word. Garm. Ethan didn't know that name. Bourne explained quickly. Garm Hook, a bounty hunter. He's hired by the guards who bring the condemned to the ravine. He comes 2 weeks after each delivery to make sure the meat has been eaten. If the condemned man is alive, it means the guards won't get their cut from the Baron. And Baron Lucian Morvet really hates losing money. Ethan looked at Bourne. He asked what would happen if Garm found him alive. Bourne said that Garm would put a bounty on his head, and he'd come with men, and he'd burn down a few huts as a warning, just like he'd done before. Ethan looked at the village, at the huts, at the people who had just started eating his food, at Marin holding the dough, at Nora with hope in her eyes, at Claire with her recipes, at Sonet with her onions. The horn sounded again, closer this time. Ethan stood up. He brushed off Hannah's apron. He looked at Bourne and said he needed a table. Bourne didn't understand. Ethan repeated himself. A table, boards, anything. Set it up at the entrance to the village. Bourne said he'd gone mad. Ethan replied that maybe he had, but he needed a table anyway. An hour later, a rickety table made of 3 boards resting on 2 stumps stood at the village entrance. 2 pots sat on the table. Ethan was cooking, quickly. 1 pot contained meat broth made from the leftover venison, hot, thick, smelling so good that half the village's stomachs began to rumble. The second pot was empty, for Garm, if he wanted it. Garm Hook emerged from the forest an hour after the second horn blast. He was exactly as Ethan had imagined him. Tall, broad, leather armor, 2 blades at his belt, a face scarred with cuts, small, intelligent eyes, not a dumb thug, a smart thug, which is much worse. 4 men followed Garm, mercenaries, armed. Garm stopped in front of the table. He looked at Ethan, at his apron, at the pots, and burst out laughing. He said that criminal number 77 was not only alive, but was also serving the guests. Wonderful. The Baron would be delighted to learn that his meat was walking around and cooking. Ethan didn't flinch. He stood behind his crooked table made of 3 planks and stared at Garm. Behind him stood the entire village, 63 people, silent. Ethan pointed to the pot of broth, then to the empty pot. He said that Garm had a choice. 1 pot contained broth, ordinary meat broth, venison, from the forest. The second pot was empty, but if Garm wanted, he could fill it with the meat he was used to getting from Loschina. Let him eat it in front of everyone. Ethan knew something from Bourne. Garm wasn't just checking to see if the condemned were alive. He was taking some of the meat for himself. Human flesh. He sold it on the black market in the border towns as an exotic medicine. Ethan didn't know for sure if Garm ate it himself, but he knew that people who trade in such meat usually taste it themselves. Garm stopped laughing. His eyes narrowed. He looked at the empty pot, then at Ethan, then at the village behind him. He asked what Ethan meant. Ethan said calmly, "Everyone here knows that Garm takes the meat. Everyone here knows where it goes. Everyone here kept quiet because they were afraid. But he, Ethan, isn't afraid. Because he's dead. Criminal 77 is already dead on paper, and the dead aren't afraid." Garm was silent. 5 seconds. 10. Then his hand rested on the hilt of his blade. He'd said that the dead aren't afraid. That's true, but the dead can be killed again. And so can those behind them. He turned toward the village, assessing. 63 damned souls. Women, children, an old man, a blacksmith. No threat to 5 armed men. He could have slaughtered half of them and no one would have known. Garm took a step forward. And at that moment, Hannah stepped out of the crowd. She was taller than Garm, and broader, and in her hand was a hammer. A blacksmith's hammer weighing 4 kilograms. Garm looked at her, then at the hammer, and he realized the situation had changed. He could have handled 63 of those damned men, but a blacksmith with a hammer in her hand was a different story. Garm shifted his gaze to Ethan. He said the Baron would find out, that the criminal, number 77, was alive, that the village was hiding him, that something wasn't right here. And then it wouldn't be just 5 who'd come, 50 would come. He turned and headed for the forest. His men followed him. On his third step, Hannah hurled the hammer. Not at Garm, at a tree next to his head. The hammer sank into the trunk to the depth of a palm. Garm froze. He didn't turn around. He stood there for a second. 2. Then he kept walking. His men were moving faster than he was. When the sound of footsteps faded, Ethan exhaled. His hands were shaking, his legs were shaking, his stomach was churning. He'd been holding on for 10 minutes on pure bluff, and now his body was reminding him of it. Hannah walked over. She pulled the hammer out of the tree. She looked at Ethan and said that he was either the bravest person she'd ever met or the dumbest. Ethan replied that in his past life, those words usually meant the same thing. Panel. Hannah's trust went from 16 to 29. Public reputation +1 level. Effect unlocked. Rumor in the neighboring village. Ethan looked at the panel. A rumor in the neighboring village. Someone outside the ravine now knew that there was a man here who fed cannibals with non-human prey. This was both good and bad. Good because help might come. Bad because enemies would hear about it too. Claire approached him after everyone had dispersed. She was pale. Her hands clutched the hem of her robe. She said quietly that Garm wasn't just a bounty hunter. He was the Cardinal's man. Garm Hook worked for Walter Hayes. In 2 weeks at most, the Cardinal would know that something unexpected was happening in the ravine, and the Cardinal doesn't like the unexpected. Claire looked him in the eyes, and she said that if he was going to save this village, he needed to do it faster. Much faster. Ethan nodded. He looked at the bonfire, at the village, at the people dispersing to their cabins. 63 people, 12 cabins, 300 years of a curse, a cast-iron skillet, a handful of yeast, a packet of tomato seeds, a blacksmith's hammer stuck in a tree, and the Cardinal on the horizon. Ethan put on Hannah's apron and returned to the bonfire. Tomorrow would be a new day, a new list of names, new plates, and less time than he'd thought. Hannah brought the knife on the 14th day. She didn't say a word. She just walked into the shed where Ethan was sleeping and placed it on the floor next to his head. Ethan woke up to the sound of metal striking stone. He opened his eyes. He saw the knife. Old, dark, with a handle wrapped in cracked leather. The blade was dull but sharp, sharpened 1,000 times. Ethan sat up. He picked up the knife. He felt its weight, heavier than usual, as if it contained something other than metal. He stepped out of the shed. Hannah was standing by the fire, her back to him. Her shoulders were tense. Her hands were clenched into fists. Ethan approached and stood beside her, saying nothing. Hannah spoke without turning around. She said it was her husband's knife, the very one, the one he used to kill their son, the one he used to cut up the body of his own firstborn when the curse consumed his mind, the one he used to feed himself for 3 days until he hanged himself from a beam in their cabin. Hannah found the knife in his hand, his dead hand. She pulled it out, and ever since she'd been heating it in the forge every night. 12 years, every night. She didn't know why. She couldn't throw it away. She couldn't stab herself with it. She couldn't reforge it. It just lay in the forge, reddening from the heat and cooling by morning. 12 years of the same thing. Ethan listened. He held the knife in his hands and felt its warmth. The metal still retained the heat from its last time in the forge. He turned the knife so the blade faced the light. He placed his hand on it. The panel flashed. Object: the Breckenridge knife. Iron, hand-forged. Age: 18 years. History: murder weapon. Potential: can be reforged into a kitchen tool. When reforged by the bearer of the knife's history, the effect of all dishes prepared with this knife increases by 50% for the residents of the Hollow. Condition: the reforging must be performed by someone who knows the knife's history and does so voluntarily. Ethan lowered the knife. He looked at Hannah. She was still standing with her back to him. He said quietly, "Reforging it." Hannah didn't move. He said it again. "Reforging it into a chef's knife." He'll feed this village with it every day, until he dies. Let this metal that took a life now give one." Hannah turned around. Her eyes were red, dry. She wasn't crying. She'd stopped crying 12 years ago. She looked at Ethan, and he saw something inside her break. Not in a bad way, in the way a dam breaks after holding back water for 12 years. She took the knife from his hands. Silently, she walked toward the furnace. Ethan followed her. The forge stood by the farthest hut, stone, rough, with deer-hide bellows. Hannah stoked the fire. She placed the knife in the flames and began to work. She forged all night. Ethan sat nearby on a rock and listened to the clang of the hammer on metal, blow after blow, hour after hour. Hannah didn't stop. Sweat streamed down her face and hands. Sparks flew into the darkness. She howled with each blow, quietly, not from pain, from something else. She forged, and everything she had held inside for 12 years poured out of her. Each blow of the hammer was a year, a blow. The year she found her son's body. A blow. The year she took her husband down from the beam. A blow. The year she stopped sleeping. A blow. The year she stopped crying. 12 blows, 12 years, and on the 13th blow, she stopped. A new knife lay on the anvil, a chef's knife with a wide blade, perfectly balanced. Ethan could see that even in the dark. It was a knife for cutting meat, vegetables, and bread. A kitchen knife, not a murder weapon. Hannah picked it up, turned it over in her hands, and then she did something Ethan didn't expect. She went into the cabin. She came back a minute later. In her hand was a small bone, white, smooth, a child's bone. Ethan understood. It was her son's bone. She had kept it all these years. Hannah inserted the bone into the knife's handle, secured it with wire, wrapped it with a strip of leather, and handed the knife to Ethan. Her voice was hoarse and brittle. She told him to feed now, not kill. Ethan took the knife. The handle was warm from the bone and metal and from Hannah's hands. He looked at the blade. It reflected the fire from the forge and his own face, and Hannah's face. And then she began to cry. For the first time in 12 years. Not quietly, loudly. The way people cry who've forgotten how to do it and now remember it all at once. She cried, her broad shoulders shaking, and she covered her face with the hands that had forged knives for killing, but now held a knife for eating. Ethan didn't hug her. He didn't comfort her. He just stood beside her, holding the knife, because sometimes that's all it takes, just standing there. The panel flashed gold, brighter than ever. Hannah's trust went from 29 to 71. Item obtained: the Breckenridge kitchen knife. Effect: plus 50% to the effect of all dishes for the residents of the ravine. Unique bonus: meals prepared with this knife remove an additional 0.1% of the curse with each serving. Ethan gripped the handle. 0.1%. It sounds like nothing, but at 63 servings a day, that's 6.3%. In 10 days, 63%. The numbers were finally starting to add up. In the morning, Ethan went out to the campfire with his new knife. Claire had baked 3 flatbreads overnight. The sourdough starter she'd set up 4 days ago had finally kicked in. Yeast-free bread, made with water and wild grains. Coarse, but edible. Ethan sliced the first flatbread with Hannah's knife. Smoothly. Smoothly. The knife glided through the dough like butter. Claire gasped. She said she'd never seen a knife cut bread like that. Ethan replied that it wasn't a knife. It was 12 years of grief forged into steel. Claire looked at him, then at the knife, then at Hannah, who was sitting by the hearth with red eyes, and for the first time in a long while wasn't hiding her face. Claire said quietly that she needed to show him something. She led him behind the hut. She pulled a thin notebook from under her habit, worn, with scorched edges. She said it was her mentor's diary, the very same mentor who had burned the pregnant woman and called it an act of mercy. The diary contained names, All the names of the people the Church of Light had sent to the ravine over the past 40 years, with dates, with reasons for their condemnation, with seals. Claire had stolen the diary the night she fled the convent. She hadn't known why at the time. Now she knew. It was evidence. Proof that the church knew about the curse, knew that it was sending people not to monsters but to victims, and continued to send them. 40 years according to this diary alone, and 300 according to the pact with the deity of hunger. Ethan took the notebook. His hands didn't tremble. He opened the first page. Names. Dozens of names. Next to each one a short line. Thief, heretic, debtor, vagrant, prostitute. Each name was a person who had been brought here in a cage and left to die, or to become what the curse forced them to be here. He closed the notebook. He asked Claire if she knew how many names there were in total. Claire said 112 over 40 years. Ethan did the math. 112 in 40 years. If the ratio is roughly the same over 300 years, that's about 800 people. 800 lives sacrificed to the curse so that the crown and the church could sleep soundly. He tucked the notebook into his shirt front. He told Claire that it was the most important thing in the village. More important than his frying pan. More important than Hannah's knife. Claire nodded. She knew. That evening, Ethan prepared dinner. 16 individual plates, each with its own name, each with its own story. Hannah's knife sliced through meat, roots, and herbs, and each time the panel added 0.1% to the weakening of the curse. The numbers were rising. Slowly but surely. The village's overall trust was 487. The village's curse averaged 96.2%. According to his calculations, there were about 75 days left until the Order of Ash arrived. But Claire said that Garm would speed everything up, that the cardinal would find out and move up the timeline. Ethan was chopping carrots with a knife made from the bone of a dead child, thinking about how, in his past life, his biggest problem had been a health inspection rigged by a competitor, and now his biggest problem was 200 knights with orders to burn the village to the ground. She arrived on the 20th day, too clean for a pilgrim, too calm for a traveler who'd wandered into the forest of the damned. Claire spotted her first. She ran up to Ethan and said one word. Spy. Ethan wiped his hands on his apron and went out to the gate. The girl was standing on the road, 22, maybe 24 years old. Her hair was tucked under the hood of a gray habit. Her hands were folded across her stomach. Her posture was humble. Her eyes were sharp. She introduced herself. Evelyn, a pilgrim of the Church of Light. Heading to the holy spring in the north, she'd lost her way. She asked for water and a place to stay for the night. Everything was spoken evenly and smoothly, like a memorized line. Ethan activated the panel. Name, Evelyn Hayes. Age, 22. Status, spy for Cardinal Walter Hayes. Family relationship, niece. Objective, reconnaissance of the situation in Loshchina prior to a punitive expedition. Trust, -20. Ethan read the numbers and gave nothing away. -20. He'd never seen negative numbers on the panel before. This was an enemy, a real enemy. Not Garm with his blades and greed. Garm was a mercenary, a tool. Evelyn was the eyes and ears of the man who was deciding Loshchina's fate. Son A stood on the roof, bow in hand, arrow nocked. She was looking at Evelyn, and Ethan could see that a single nod would be enough for her. A single word. He didn't nod. He said Evelyn could come in. Bourne grabbed him by the elbow. He hissed that it was madness. Claire clenched her fists. Nora led Marin behind the hut. Ethan repeated himself. Let her come in. She's hungry, so she'll eat. That's the rule. His rule. Whoever comes to his table gets a plate. Bourne let go of his elbow. He spat on the ground. He walked away. Evelyn entered the village. She walked slowly, looking around. Ethan could see her eyes taking everything in. The huts, the people, the weapons, the exits. She was well trained. Every step was precise. Every gesture was calculated. But there was one thing she hadn't expected: a scent. From behind Ethan's hut came the smell of bread, fresh sourdough bread that Claire had baked that morning, and roasted meat with wild garlic, and something herbal and warm. For a second, Evelyn let her guard down. Her nostrils twitched. Her pace slowed. Her eyes stopped counting and began searching for the source of the scent. Ethan noticed. He always noticed. In the kitchen, he could tell 200 customers apart with a single glance at their faces as they opened the menu. This one is hungry. This one is sad. This one didn't come for food, but to have someone seat him at a table and bring him a plate. Evelyn had come for information, but her body had come for something else. Ethan sat her down by the fire. He set a pot in front of her. He placed his hand on a piece of venison. The panel. A recipe for Evelyn Hayes. The effect depends on the content. Content unavailable. Reason. Trust, -20. The cook knows nothing about the diner except their name and status. Cook blindly or find out more. Ethan withdrew his hand. He couldn't cook blindly. The system would punish him for a nameless plate. He needed a story. Her story. He sat down across from her. He said he only cooks for people he knows, so let her tell him something. Anything. What she ate as a child. What her mother used to cook. What flavor she remembers best. Evelyn looked at him. Her mask was still on. A polite smile. She said she grew up in a convent, that the food at the convent was simple. Bread, porridge, vegetable soup. Ethan shook his head. No. He hadn't asked about the convent. He'd asked about her mother. Evelyn fell silent. Her mask wavered, slightly, for a split second, but it wavered. She said she didn't remember her mother. Ethan said that everyone remembers their mother, even those who think they've forgotten. They remember the smell, or the taste, or the feel of the plate in their hands. Something remains, always. Evelyn was silent, for a long time. The fire crackled. The village around them went about its business. Nora was cleaning hides. Hannah was forging nails. Marin was sculpting a figurine out of dough. Everything looked peaceful. Everything looked the way a village of cannibals shouldn't look. And Evelyn could see that. Ethan waited. He didn't press her. He didn't ask again. He just sat there and waited. 4 minutes later, Evelyn spoke, quietly, almost in a whisper. She said that before the convent she had lived with her mother for 2 years. Her mother was from a minor noble family. She had been married off to a man from the Hayes family, the cardinal's brother. Her mother was unhappy. The only thing she was good at was cooking. Every evening she would cook a thick soup made of turnips and lard with caraway seeds. Evelyn was 4 when her mother died. She remembered only that soup, the taste of caraway, the smell of melted lard, the heavy clay bowl in her hands, nothing else. After her mother's death, her uncle took her to the convent, to be raised there. Her upbringing consisted of attending the executions of heretics to toughen her spirit. She was 6 when she was first forced to watch a person burn. Ethan listened. He didn't interrupt. The panel refreshed. A recipe for Evelyn. Turnip soup with lard and caraway. Reproduction of a childhood taste. Effect. Trust -20, minimum. Hostility suppressed for 2 hours. But a bonus for accurately recreating a lost taste, +15 to trust. Ethan stood up. He didn't have any turnips. He didn't have any lard. He didn't have any caraway. But he had wild roots that tasted like turnips if boiled long enough. There was deer fat, and there was the herb Claire had found by the stream 2 days ago. Bitter, with a pungent smell, not cumin, but close. He cooked for 20 minutes, in silence. Evelyn sat by the fire and watched. The mask was still on, but her hands rested on her knees rather than folded across her stomach. Relaxed, just a little. Ethan took the pot off the fire. He poured the stew into a bowl, a clay one, heavy. Claire had found it in the ruins of an old hut on the edge of the village. Ethan set the bowl in front of Evelyn. She looked down. at the murky, yellowish liquid with chunks of roots and a film of fat on the surface. It didn't look pretty. It didn't look appetizing. But the smell. The smell rose from the bowl, and Ethan saw Evelyn's face change. Slowly, like a sunrise. The mask slipped away. The wrinkle between her eyebrows smoothed out. Her lips twitched. She took the bowl in both hands, heavy, clay, just like when she was a child. She raised it to her lips, took a sip, and froze. She stood with her eyes closed, holding the bowl, and tears streamed down her face. Not one, not two, a torrent. Silently, without a sound, just tears down her cheeks and chin and onto her cassock. She drank and cried, and drank, and cried. When the bowl was empty, she set it down on the ground. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She looked at Ethan. And for the first time all day, her eyes weren't sharp. They were bewildered. Like those of a child who'd been woken up in the middle of the night. Panel. Evelyn's trust rating went from -20 to -3. The double agent storyline has been unlocked. Evelyn stood up. She smoothed out her robe. She put her mask back on. But it was crooked. The mask no longer fit properly. She thanked him for the food. Coldly. Politely. She asked to be shown a place to spend the night. Bourne led her to an empty hut on the edge of the village. Sun-A watched her from the roof until dawn. In the morning, the hut was empty. Evelyn had left during the night. But under Ethan's pillow lay a rolled-up sheet of parchment. A map. The order of Ash's route. Dates. Numbers. Composition. 200 knights. 40 crossbowmen. 10 priests bearing the blessings of the light. And the arrival date, not in 90 days, in 40. The cardinal had expedited the order. Ethan held the map in his hands and the numbers danced before his eyes. 40 days. He'd had 90, now 40. He'd lost 50 days because of a single note. Claire read the map over his shoulder. She turned pale. She said 40 days was impossible. Ethan replied that 1 plate for 12 cannibals had also been impossible. And then it became 20 plates for 63 people. Claire said that plates wouldn't stop crossbow bolts. Ethan replied that he knew, but the bolts wouldn't stop what he was about to do. He didn't yet know exactly what he was going to do, but it sounded convincing. 40 days. Ethan stood by the campfire on the morning of the 21st day, looking out at the village. 40 days minus the one that had already passed. 39. The panel displayed the numbers. The village's total trust was 612. The village's average curse level was 91.7%. 8 residents had a curse level below 80. 2 were below 60. Marin was below 50. 0 were completely cleansed. To completely lift the curse from one person, 10,000 points of total trust were needed. He had 612. The math was brutal. But Hannah's knife changed the equation. Every portion prepared with that knife removed an additional 0.1% of the curse. 63 portions a day is 6.3% a day distributed among the residents. Over 39 days, that's 245%. Divided among 63 people, that's about 3.9% for each person. Not enough. Catastrophically insufficient. But Ethan wasn't thinking about percentages. He was thinking about people. Specific people. Marin with a 47% curse. If he concentrated all the bonuses on her, all the additional reductions, all the trust points, he could reduce her curse to 0 in 20 days. One child, completely free of the curse. But that meant the other 62 people would get nothing. And in 39 days, they would face the Order of Ash still cursed. Still cannibals in the eyes of the knights. Still monsters that could be killed without a shred of guilt. Ethan made his decision. Not now. In 2 days. First, he had to do something he hadn't done once since he arrived. Feed the entire village at once. Not with a single plate, with 63 plates. Each one personal, each one with a name, each one with a story. He spent 2 days preparing. Suna brought 2 deer and a wild boar. Claire baked 20 flatbreads. The children gathered a basket of horned mushrooms and 3 sacks of wild herbs. Hannah forged 12 iron bowls. Rough, heavy, but real bowls. Not stones or burdock leaves. Bowls. Wren carved a name on each bowl, the name of the person it belonged to. 12 bowls for 63 people isn't enough, but it's a start. The rest ate from pots, stones, and leaves, but Ethan scratched a name onto something for each of them. On a stone, on a piece of bark, on a wooden spoon that Wren had carved overnight, for everyone. The 23rd day, evening. Ethan stood before the campfire, and in front of him, on a long table made of planks, stood 63 plates. No, not plates. 63 messages for Born. Meat broth with angelica root, because Born once said that his mother used to cook angelica when he was sick. For Wren, sautéed mushrooms on a wooden platter that Wren carved himself. For Fira, braised venison wrapped in burdock leaves tied with sinew, just like the first time. For Gray, meat on a white stone. He brought the stone himself, 248. For Sona, mushrooms with mint, just like from her brother. For Nora, broth in that very same pot. For Marin, a flatbread with a dough figurine, a little horse, crooked but recognizable. For Hannah, roasted venison sliced with her own knife. For Claire, bread she baked herself, sliced by Ethan, with reindeer fat butter. 63 plates, one for each person. Not a single one was the same. Ethan cooked from dawn till dusk, 12 hours. Hannah's knife didn't stop for a single minute. Claire kneaded the dough. Sana cut up the meat. Nora peeled the roots. Even Marin helped. She placed dough figures on each child's plate. 4 figures, 4 children in the village, one for each. When everything was ready, Ethan stepped out into the square. 63 people stood around the table, in silence. They looked at their plates, at their names, at the food that had been prepared separately for each of them. No one moved. Ethan said they could sit down. Born sat down first, then Nora, then Gray and Fira, side by side, his hand on her knee. Her nails were light gray, almost normal. Then the rest sat down, and they ate. In silence at first. Then someone chuckled, someone sniffed, someone laughed quietly. Born said the broth tasted just like his mother's. Wren said the mushrooms were better than his mother's, and got a tap on the back of the head from Hannah. Everyone laughed. For the first time in a long while, the laughter in Mossy Hollow sounded not like a mask, but like real laughter. The panel exploded with numbers. Every resident's trust score rose. For some, by 5. For others, by 10. For others still, by 15. The total trust score for Village 612 rose to 1,847, a huge jump. The panel added a new line. Collective effect. First communal dinner. Bonus. All participants receive a 2% reduction in the curse, simultaneously. Ethan blinked. 2%. For all 63 of them. Just for sitting down at the same table and each eating their own plate. The village's curse dropped on average from 91.7 to 89.7%. Marin's dropped to 45. And then Ethan realized it. The system wasn't rewarding them just for eating. The system was rewarding them for community. For the fact that 63 people sat down together. But everyone got their own meal. Not a communal stew, not from a nameless pot. A personal plate in a circle of people who know your name. That was what he'd been doing at the restaurant in Portland. 12 tables. The menu changes every day to suit a specific guest. But everyone sits in the same dining room. Everyone hears the same music. Everyone smells the same aroma from the kitchen. Home. Ethan realized that the system was called the hearth, not because he cooked over a fire, but because the hearth is the place around which a family gathers. The evening continued. Marin climbed onto Ethan's lap. Nora watched them from across the table. Her eyes were moist. Hannah shouted a toast, not with words, but with a sound. She simply raised her bowl and roared so loudly that birds flew up from the nearest tree. Everyone raised their bowls. Claire stood up and began to read, not a prayer, but a poem she had written herself that night by the light of Hannah's horn. About home, about the table, about bread, about the names on the bowls. Sanna sat on the edge, alone, but not on the roof, not on the sidelines, at the edge of the communal table. She wasn't smiling, but she was there. And for the first time since Ethan had seen her, she was sitting without her bow. The board. The village's overall trust rating, 1847. The village's curse rating, 89.7% on average. Marin, 45. The lottery. Prize. The book Home Preserving, 1954. Ethan laughed. Out loud. Everyone looked at him. He said he'd received a gift, a book, on preserving. Now he could stock up. Salt meat, dry mushrooms, pickle roots. Food wouldn't run out every evening. He'd be able to cook in advance. Bourne asked what canning was. Ethan explained. Bourne said it was witchcraft. Ethan replied that it was science. Bourne said he didn't see the difference. On the 25th day, Nora came to him at night. Ethan wasn't asleep. He was sitting by the fire, taking inventory of his supplies. 3 deer carcasses salted according to a recipe from a 1954 book. 20 bundles of dried mushrooms. A sack of wild grain. Sourdough starter in a pot. Tomato seeds he'd planted in the ground behind the cabin. They wouldn't sprout until the order arrived. But if the village survived the order, they'd have tomatoes in 2 months. If. Nora sat down beside him, in silence. She smelled of smoke and moss and something else, something warm. She said that Marin had called him Uncle Ethan that evening. Ethan nodded. He'd heard. Nora said that Marin hadn't called anyone that before. Not a single man in the village. She was afraid of men, ever since she saw what Hannah's husband had done. Ethan was silent. Nora was silent. The fire crackled. Then Nora spoke. Not about Marin, about herself. She said that 3 years ago she had eaten her neighbor, right in front of her daughter. The withdrawal set in on the 4th day. She didn't remember how it happened. She only remembered Marin's eyes. Round. Empty. Not frightened. Empty. As if something inside the child had simply switched off. Since then, Marin hadn't called her mom. 3 years. 1,000 days. Every day, Nora waited for that word. Every day, she didn't hear it. Ethan turned to her. He asked if she wanted him back. Nora looked at him. She said she didn't deserve it. Ethan said it wasn't about deserving it. It was about the fact that Marin needed a mother. Not a perfect one. A real one. One who had made mistakes and was ready to admit them. Nora asked how. Ethan said he knew how. He suggested they cook together. Not for the village, for Marin. 1 plate, mother and cook together. Nora cooks while Ethan guides her. And when Marin takes the plate from Nora's hands, it won't be food from Ethan. It will be food from Mom. Nora was silent for a long time. Then she nodded. They started in the morning. Ethan stood behind Nora and told her what to do. Nora was chopping root vegetables. Her hands were shaking. She was used to holding a knife differently, for something else. Ethan gently corrected her grip. Not like a weapon, like a tool. Nora sliced the wild carrots. Crooked, uneven. But she sliced them. She put them in the pot, added water, set it on the stove. Ethan gave her some dried mushrooms. She tossed them into the broth. She stirred it. He said she needed to stir more slowly. She stirred more slowly. The broth simmered. Nora stood over the pot and looked at it as if it were a bomb. Ethan said the broth wouldn't bite her. Nora didn't smile, but her shoulders dropped slightly. 30 minutes later, the broth was ready. Nora poured it into a small bowl, the bowl with Marin's name on it. Her hands were shaking. The broth spilled. Ethan didn't help. He didn't hold the bowl steady. He didn't take it from her hands. She had to do it herself. Nora carried the bowl to the cabin. Marin was sitting on the threshold, molding a figure out of dough. She saw her mother. She saw the bowl. She looked at Ethan standing behind her. Ethan nodded. Nora knelt down in front of her daughter. She held out the bowl. Her hands were still shaking. The broth was still spilling. Nora said quietly, "This is for you." "I made it, all by myself." Maren looked at her mother, at the bowl, at the hands that were shaking. Her little fingers reached for the bowl, took it, brought it to her mouth. A sip. Maren drank, never taking her eyes off her mother. Sip after sip. When the bowl was empty, Maren wiped her mouth with her palm. She looked at Nora and said, "Mom, it's good." 2 words. "Mom, it's good." Nora froze. Her face didn't move. Her body didn't move. Nothing moved. Then her chin trembled, and she began to cry. Not like Hannah, quietly, her mouth open. No sound, just tears. She reached out and hugged Maren, pulled her close. Maren didn't resist. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't pull away. For the first time in 3 years, she let her mother hug her. Panel. Nora's trust went from 47 to 68. Maren's curse went from 45 to 41. Bonus. The mother-daughter bond has been restored. Permanent effect. Every dish Nora cooks for Maren removes an additional 0.5% of the curse. Ethan stood 5 steps away and watched, and he felt something hot and salty roll down his cheek. He wiped his face with Hannah's apron. A chef doesn't cry in the kitchen. That's rule number 1. He was breaking it for the 2nd time in his life. The first time was when his grandmother died, and he opened her diner for the first time that morning, realizing that no one would make breakfast. Now Nora cooked every day, for Maren, morning and night. A bowl with her daughter's name on it. Broth, a flatbread, roasted root vegetables, something simple. Nora wasn't a good cook. She oversalted and undercooked everything, and her cuts were crooked. But Maren ate it all. Every day, Maren's curse took its toll. 41, 39, 36, 33, faster than anyone else's. The mother-daughter bond acted as an accelerator. On the 30th day, Ethan gathered the village. He stood by the fire and spoke. Not a long speech, a short one. He said that in 30 days, 200 knights would arrive. They would come to kill, not because the people of the Hollow were bad, but because it suited someone's interests for them to be monsters. Cardinal Hayes, Baron Morvet, the Church of Light. For 300 years, they had been feeding people to this village and calling it order. Ethan said they had a choice, to take the hemlock from Bourne and die quietly, or to stand up, not as monsters, as people, to show the knights who they really were. Bourne stood up first, an old man with a scarred face. He said that 30 days ago he had wanted to give the children poison. Today he wants to look a knight in the eye and say his name. Wren stood up. Fira. Gray beside her. Hannah. She didn't stand up. She was already standing, with a hammer in her hand. Son A on the roof. She raised her bow. Nora with Maren in her arms. Claire in her habit. 63 people. Everyone was standing. The panel. The village's total trust had risen from 1,847 to 2,934. A collective surge. A collective oath. Ethan looked at the number. 2,934. Faster. Everything was moving faster. When people decide not to die together, the numbers grow faster than from any plate. But 30 days is still not enough. Against 200 knights. 63 former cannibals. A blacksmith, a huntress, a cook, a nun, and a 5-year-old girl eating bread for the first time in her life. Ethan looked up at the sky. 30 days. Ethan turned those 30 days into an assembly line. Every day began in the dark. He got up 2 hours before dawn and started preparing. Hannah's knife never stopped moving. Claire baked bread. Nora made broth for Marin. Son A went into the forest and came back with meat. Ren built things. Not figurines. Tables. Benches. Racks for drying meat. Storage shelves. Fira knitted nets for catching fish in the stream Ethan had found a 3-hour walk away. Gray carried stones for the new oven Ethan had designed from memory. An oven made of stone and clay, with a chimney, with 2 levels. Fire at the bottom, a baking stone at the top. He drew blueprints on the ground with a stick, and Gray built it. Every day, stone by stone. On the 5th day, the oven was ready. The first loaf of bread from the oven, not from the campfire, was different. Even, golden, with a crispy crust. Marin took a bite, and her eyes went wide. She said a word she hadn't known before. Bread. Not a root, not meat. Bread. Ethan salted 20 kilos of venison using recipes from a 1954 cookbook. He dried 40 bundles of mushrooms. He pickled wild cabbage in a herbal brine. Every day, the display showed a new lottery prize. A toothbrush, a spool of twine, 3 meters of gauze, a packet of dried basil, trifles, things that, in his past life, had sat neglected on shelves. Here, each one made a difference. Marin got the toothbrush, the first one in her life. She brushed her teeth 7 times a day until Nora took the toothbrush away and explained that twice was enough. The gauze was used for bandages. Hannah's hands were always burned. Now they were burned and bandaged. Progress. Meanwhile, Ethan was preparing the village for battle. Not for battle, for a gathering. He refused to call it a battle. He called it a dinner for 200 plates. Hannah was forging, not swords, not spears, shields, from whatever metal was available. Thin, light, not for war, so that the first volley of crossbows wouldn't kill anyone in the first second. Son A was training 10 people to shoot bows. Not to kill, just to shoot. Ethan insisted. Not a single arrow at a person, only at their feet. Only into the ground in front of them. Just a warning. Sunna said he was crazy, that the knights wouldn't stop for an arrow in the ground. Ethan said that if they killed even one knight, they would confirm everything the church had been saying about them for 300 years. Cannibals, monsters, murderers. A single death would undo everything he'd done. Sunna looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. Arrows into the ground. Claire was working on another plan. She was sewing a cassock. Her old cassock from the Church of Light. She was mending it, washing it, ironing it with a stone. Ethan asked why. Claire said that the Knights of the Order of Ash cannot shoot a servant of the church. It's the law, an ancient law. If she stands before them in her cassock with the sign of the light on her chest, they must lower their weapons. At least for a while. At least for a minute. And that minute might be enough. Ethan asked what if it wasn't enough. Claire said that then she would die in her cassock. And that too would be proof. Proof that the order kills its own. Ethan said he wouldn't let her die. Claire smiled and said he couldn't promise that. But thank you. On the 35th day, Marin said a word that brought the village to a standstill. She was playing with the other children in the square. 4 children, all cursed, all with a curse level above 80%. Marin had a curse level of 22, the purest of them all. And she stopped right in the middle of the game. She looked at the boy next to her. His name was Thomas, 7 years old, a curse of 88%. Marin said that Thomas's eyes were turning dark. Ethan heard her. He walked over. He asked what she meant. Marin said she could see it, around Thomas, something dark, like smoke, but not smoke. It moves, and it's hungry. The panel flashed. New ability unlocked. Marin Veld. Vision of residual hunger. Once the curse drops below 25%, the bearer can see an oncoming episode in other cursed individuals. Radius, 20 meters. Accuracy, 6 hours before the episode. Ethan grabbed the edge of the table. Marin could see the curse. She could see when someone in the village was about to snap. 6 hours in advance. That was enough time to prepare a plate, a personal one, with a name, with a story, and to stop the fit before it began. Marin became a walking early warning system. From that day on, she walked around the village and told Ethan whose eyes were darkening. Quietly, in a whisper, like a little secret between them. "Dad, Ethan, Aunt Fira has smoke around her hands. Dad, Ethan, Uncle Ren's eyes are cloudy." Ethan cooked, plate after plate, one episode after another. Not a single breakdown in 10 days. Not a single one. For the first time in 300 years, a week passed in Mossy Hollow without anyone losing their mind from hunger. Dashboard. Overall Village Trust, 4,218. Village Curse, 79.3% on average. Marin, 18%. On the 40th day, what everyone had been waiting for happened. Marin woke up in the morning and asked for food. Not a root, not meat. Bread. Just bread. Ethan gave her a flatbread. She ate the whole thing. And the panel showed it. Marin's curse dropped from 18 to 12. Bonus. The first completely voluntary intake of regular food without suppressing an attack. Her body had begun to accept non-human food as the norm. 12% remained until complete purification. Ethan looked at Nora. Nora was standing against the wall, clenching her fists. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. 12%. So close. On the 45th day, the first pilgrim arrived. Not a spy, a real one. A young man from a village near the border. He'd heard a rumor about the cook in Mossy Hollow, about the village of cannibals who'd stopped eating people, about how the food there made illnesses go away. His mother was sick with a fever that had lasted a month. Herbal remedies didn't help. He'd walked 3 days through the forest to the village of monsters because he had nothing else to hope for. Ethan fed his mother. Chicken broth. No, deer broth with herbs for fever. The panel displayed the recipe. For a stranger, not for a resident of the hollow. The effect was weak, but enough. The fever had subsided by morning. The young man knelt before Ethan and wept. Ethan helped him up, told him it wasn't necessary, told him that food didn't require gratitude on one's knees. Just one thing, tell them what you saw. Tell them back home. Tell them that people live here, not monsters, people. The young man left. A week later, 2 more arrived, then 4. The rumor spread. A sorcerer cook from the cursed Loshchina feeds cannibals with non-human food, cures fever with broth. The panel. Public reputation, +2 levels. Effect unlocked, regional fame. Ethan looked at the numbers and thought, fame is good, but fame attracts more than just pilgrims. It attracts those who want this village dead. 15 days remained until the Order of Ash. There were no torches on the horizon yet, but there would be. Ethan sharpened Hannah's knife and prepared breakfast for 63 plates, and for 4 plates for the pilgrims. And he thought that 200 plates for the knights was a lot. But he'd handled the New Year's banquet for 80 people all by himself. He'd handle this too. Probably. On the 50th day, Ethan woke up to silence. Not to a scream, not to a howl, to silence. The village was silent. No sound of Hannah's hammer, no creak of Sone's bowstring, no children's laughter. He stepped out of the barn and saw that everyone was standing by the southern road. 63 people, silent, looking south. Ethan approached. Bourne turned to face him. His face was ashen. He said one word. Morvet. Baron Lucien Morvet had sent a messenger. Not soldiers, not knights. A messenger. A boy of about 15 in dirty clothes carrying a sealed letter. Claire broke the seal and read it aloud. Baron Morvet informed the residents of Mossy Hollow that, due to a violation of traditional order and the harboring of a convicted criminal, he was depriving the village of its right to receive provisions from the border trading posts. Furthermore, Any merchant caught selling goods to or from Mossy Hollow will be hanged. Furthermore, any pilgrim heading toward the village will be detained and interrogated as an accomplice to heretics. Furthermore, the Baron declares Ethan Reed, also known as Criminal Number 77, an outlaw. A reward of 200 gold coins has been offered for his head. Claire finished reading and set the letter down. The silence grew thicker. Ethan took the letter from her hands. He reread it. 200 gold coins? For his head? He didn't know if that was a lot by local standards. Bourne had said it was a village headman's annual income. For that money, any farmer within a 3-day journey would gladly slit his throat in his sleep. Ethan nodded. He asked what withholding provisions meant. Bourne explained. Once every 2 months, border traders brought salt to the area around the ravine. Cloth, rope, iron for Hannah's forge. Not out of kindness, for a fee. The village paid with hides and wild honey, and sometimes with items stripped from the bodies of the condemned. Now that would stop. No salt, no iron, no cloth. Ethan looked at his supplies. Salted meat, dried mushrooms, grain. Enough for 20 days if they rationed. But without new supplies of salt, he wouldn't be able to preserve food any longer. Without iron, Hannah wouldn't be able to forge. Without cloth, Fira wouldn't be able to sew winter clothes. The Baron had slit their throats not with a sword, but with a piece of paper. Ethan sat down on a rock. He closed his eyes. He thought. The panel displayed the morning list. 6 people on the verge of a breakdown. Marin saw dark smoke surrounding 4 of them. For 2, it was almost black. 6 o'clock. Time to cook. But there was only enough meat left for 2 days, and Sana hadn't returned from the hunt yet. Ethan opened his eyes. He looked at the village, at the people who were looking at him, waiting. Everyone was waiting for what he would say, for what he would do, for what he would prepare. He stood up. He said that the Baron had cut off the roads. That meant help from outside wouldn't come. That meant they were on their own. That meant they had to become self-sufficient within 15 days. Until the order arrived. He turned to Bourne. He asked if there were clay deposits in the forest. Bourne nodded. By the northern stream. Ethan said he needed clay. Lots of clay. He would make pottery. Storage jars, bowls, pitchers, anything that could be fired in Hannah's kiln. He turned to Sun-Ah, who was standing on the roof with a bow. He said he needed fish, not meat, fish. There were trout in the stream a 3-hour walk away. Fira had knitted some nets. It was time to use them. He turned to Ren. He said they needed barrels, for salting, for storing water, for everything. Ren nodded. He turned to Claire. He told her she needed to copy down from the book on food preservation all the recipes that work without salt. Drying, smoking, curing, fermentation. Anything that preserves food without that one ingredient the Baron had taken from them. Claire nodded and walked away with the book. Ethan stood in the middle of the village and handed out assignments. And for the first time, he felt that the village was listening to him, not as a lucky outsider, but as one of their own. The panel flashed quietly. Ethan's status in the village had been updated. From outsider to voice of the village. Bonus. All tasks assigned by Ethan and accepted voluntarily increased the rate of trust growth by 10%. 3 days later, Ethan stood by the smokehouse. He'd built it himself out of stones and clay from memory. His grandmother used to smoke fish in an iron barrel in the backyard of the diner. He remembered the smell. He remembered the temperature. He remembered how many hours of alder wood chips it took for the smoke to be just right. There was no alder here. There was birch. Not ideal. But the fish smoked and smelled so good that tears welled up in Bourne's eyes. He said he hadn't eaten smoked fish in 61 years. Ethan replied that technically he still wasn't eating any, because this portion was for Gray. Bourne cursed. Good-naturedly, the way a grandfather scolds his grandson. There was plenty of fish. The stream was full of trout. Fira knitted nets, and every day 3 men would set out at dawn and return with full baskets. And Ethan smoked the fish. He dried it. He sun-dried it. He made fish broth. He marinated it in herbal vinegar that Claire had prepared according to a recipe from a book, without salt, made with sour berries and wild sorrel. The taste was strange, sharp, unfamiliar, but the food didn't spoil for 3 days, then 5, then a week. Every day Ethan prepared 63 plates, each one personalized, each one labeled with a name. Hannah's knife never stopped. The curse was lifting, slowly but surely. 79% on average. 75. 72. Marin reached 8%. On the 55th day, Nora came to him in the evening, not at night like before. In the evening, in front of everyone. She sat down next to him by the fire, took his hand, held it, silently. Everyone saw. No one said anything. Hannah snorted and turned away. Son A on the roof pulled the bowstring a little tighter than usual. Claire smiled at her salter. Bourne shook his head and muttered that this was the last thing they needed. Nora said quietly that if they were all killed tomorrow, she wanted him to know. Ethan said he knew. Nora said he hadn't listened to the end. Ethan said he had listened. Nora looked at him, and for the first time in all the time he'd known her, she laughed. Not bitterly, not dryly, she laughed, like someone who finds something funny. Panel. Nora's trust went from 68 to 79. 10 days until the order. The order arrived a day early, as always, just as Evelyn had warned. They never knew how to arrive on time, only early. Ethan was standing by the stove, kneading dough for the morning flatbreads, when Sana whistled from the roof. 1 short whistle, then 2 long ones. That meant multiple targets from the south. Ethan wiped his hands on his apron. He went out into the square. He looked south. Torches. He counted. 10, 20, 50, 100. More than 100. He stopped counting when the line of lights stretched from one end of the horizon to the other. 200 knights of the Order of Ash, 40 crossbowmen, 10 priests. The banners of the Church of Light, white with a golden sun. And at the front, on a black horse, a man in silver armor. Sir Cassius Dorn. Bourne approached. His hands were shaking. He said it was time. Ethan asked, "Time for what?" Bourne pulled a small pouch from his belt. Inside were roots. Hemlock. Bourne said it was for the children. A quick death. Better than fire. Ethan took the pouch from his hands, silently. He walked over to the bonfire and threw it into the flames. The hemlock flared up and burned out in 3 seconds. Bourne watched the flames. Then he looked at Ethan. Ethan said that no one would die today. Not the children, not the adults, not the knights. Bourne said he was a madman. Ethan replied that perhaps he was, but madmen sometimes survive. An hour later, the order stood at the entrance to the village. 200 men in armor, crossbows loaded, swords drawn. Priests recited the prayer of light, low, resonant, like a funeral march. Sir Cassius Dorn dismounted. He removed his helmet. His face was young, 30, maybe 35 years old. Gray eyes, a firm jaw, a scar on his left temple. He stood before the village and spoke. His voice was steady, commanding. He said that in the name of the Church of Light and by order of Cardinal Walter Hayes, the inhabitants of Misty Hollow were being offered the chance to surrender for purification by fire. All who come out voluntarily will receive a quick death. Those who resist will burn slowly. Furthermore, he announced that criminal number 77, known as Ethan Reed, must be handed over alive. Furthermore, all sympathizers and those who harbor him will be executed as heretics. Silence. Ethan stood behind a crooked table made of 3 planks, the very one where he had met Garm. Only now, instead of 2 cauldrons, there were 200 bowls on the table, clay bowls that he had spent 10 days shaping, each filled with water, each with a piece of bread, each with smoked fish. 200 portions for 200 nights. Sir Cassius looked at the table, at the bowls, at the bread, at the cook in his scorched apron standing before 200 armed men, a piece of smoked trout in his hand. His expression didn't change, but his eyes lingered on the bowls for a second longer than necessary. Ethan spoke, not loudly, not grandly, just as he'd spoken to Nora when she was holding the knife, just as he'd spoken to Gray when he was howling in the hut. Calmly. He said he knew why they'd come, to burn the village, to kill the cannibals, to cleanse the land. He said he understood. He said that 3 months ago he would have done the same thing, because 3 months ago he didn't know their names. He asked Sir Cassius if he knew the name of even one resident of the Hollow. Cassius didn't answer. Ethan continued. He named them. Born, 61 years old, built houses. Nora, 27 years old, mother. Marin, 5 years old, loves bread. Ren, 34 years old, carves wooden horses. Fira, 41 years old, knits blankets. Gray, 22 years old, collects stones for his wife. He named them one after another, all 63 of them, without stumbling, without pausing, just as he would read the menu at his restaurant. Only instead of dishes, there were people. Cassius listened. His expression didn't change, but he listened. When Ethan finished, Cassius said that the names didn't undo what they had done, that they ate people, that they were monsters. Ethan nodded and said that it was all true. They ate people. Because 300 years ago, the Church of Light signed a pact with the god of hunger and placed a curse on this village. Every child born here can eat nothing but human flesh, not of their own free will, by the will of those who bear the same white banners that now stand before him. Cassius clenched his jaw. He said it was a lie, that heretics always lie. Ethan replied that he wasn't a heretic. He was a cook, and he had proof. He turned around. Claire stepped out from behind the hut, wearing a cassock, white, spotless, with the symbol of the light on her chest, a golden sun on a silver chain. The knights froze. The crossbowmen lowered their weapons by 3 centimeters. They didn't put them down, they just lowered them. Claire walked past Ethan. She stood before Cassius. She introduced herself, Clarabelle Ascot, novice of the 4th Circle at the Convent of the Morning Dawn. She opened her mentor's diary. She read aloud the first page. Names, dates, reasons for condemnation. 112 people sent to the ravine over 40 years. Thief, heretic, debtor, harlot, vagrant, each bearing the seal of the church. Cassius listened. His face changed, slowly, just as Evelyn's face had changed when she drank the soup from her childhood. Something was cracking inside, but it wasn't breaking. Not yet. Cassius raised his hand. Claire fell silent. He said the diary might be a forgery, that the novice might be an impostor, that all of this might be a trap to buy time. Ethan had been waiting for this. He turned toward the village and said one word. Marin. Marin stepped out from behind Nora, 5 years old, barefoot, wearing a dress sewn by Fira from a deer hide, her hair braided by Nora into a plait, in her hands a clay figurine of a horse. She walked slowly, not because she was afraid, because she was counting her steps. Ethan had taught her to count last week, and now she counted everything. Steps, bowls, trees, nights. She stopped in front of Sir Cassius. She looked up at him. Cassius looked down at her. 200 knights were staring at a 5-year-old girl standing barefoot on the wet ground in front of the army. Ethan said, "This is Marin, 5 years old. She was born with a curse. She didn't choose to be cursed. No one here did. But 3 months ago, her curse was 100%. Now it's 80%. She eats bread, ordinary bread, baked by her mother, who didn't choose this either." He fell silent. Marin held out a figurine to Cassius, a little horse made of dough, crooked, lopsided, with 3 legs because the 4th had broken off. She said quietly, "This is for you. You must be hungry. You've been walking a long time. Cassius didn't move. He looked at the figurine, at the child's fingers smeared with dough, at eyes that weren't the eyes of a monster. That were the eyes of a child offering food to a stranger in armor. Because he'd been walking for a long time, the knight behind Cassius lowered his crossbow, all the way to the ground. The second one didn't. The second one was aimed at Ethan. Cassius turned toward him. He raised his hand. The knight froze. Cassius didn't take the figurine, but he didn't order an attack either. He stood there looking at Marin, and something was happening inside him. Ethan saw it. He saw the armor cracking. Not the iron armor, the inner armor. Claire said quietly from behind Ethan. She'd found something in the mentor's diary. A name, one that Cassius knew. His brother. Cassius Dorn's older brother. Condemned for heresy 17 years ago. Sent to Mossy Hollow. Cassius had grown up believing that monsters had devoured his brother, that cannibals had killed him, that the ravine was a nest of evil. That's why he became a knight of the Order of Ash. That's why he's here. Claire opened the diary to the right page. She read it. Arden Dorn. Age at the time of conviction, 22. Charge, heresy. The real reason, he refused to hand over the family lands to the church. The Inquisitor's seal. Cardinal Hayes's signature. Cassius listened. His face turned white. Not gray, white, like armor. He said quietly that it was a lie. Claire said the seal was genuine. The signature was genuine. The paper was genuine. She was a former novice. She knew what church documents looked like. Cassius turned to his priests, 10 men in white robes. He asked if it was true. The priests were silent. One looked away. A second pressed his lips together. A third began to recite a prayer more loudly. Cassius turned back to Ethan. His hand rested on his sword. His knuckles were white with tension. He said that even if it were true, even if his brother had been exiled unlawfully, it didn't change the fact that the village was full of the cursed, that they were dangerous, that the curse was real, and that he had orders. Ethan nodded. He said the orders were real. The curse was real. But he could prove that the curse could be lifted, right now, in front of everyone. He turned to Marin. He looked at the panel. Marin's curse, 8%. Total village trust, 6,412. Enough. Ethan dropped to one knee in front of Marin. He said to her quietly, Marin, name 3 things you love besides food. Marin thought for a moment. She bent one finger. Mom? She bent a second. Horses made of dough. She bent her third finger. Ethan's dad. Silence. 200 knights, 63 villagers, 1 girl. The panel lit up. Condition met. A villager can name 3 things she loves besides food. Trust is sufficient. The curse is below 10%. Complete removal of the curse is available. Ethan activated it. Light. Not bright, not blinding. Warm, golden, like the light from a stove when you open the damper. It emanated from Ethan's hands and enveloped Marin. The girl wasn't afraid. She stood in that light and smiled. The light lasted 10 seconds. Then it went out. Marin stood in the same spot, barefoot, with a figurine in her hand. But something had changed. Ethan saw it. The knights saw it. Everyone saw it. Her skin, the ashen gray skin that all the inhabitants of the ravine had become normal. Pink, like a child's. Alive. The panel. Marin's curse, 8%, had dropped to 0, completely lifted. Marin Veld was no longer cursed. Nora screamed. Not out of fear, out of something greater. She fell to her knees, pulled her daughter into her arms, and screamed and cried and laughed all at once. Marin stroked her head with her small hand and said, Mommy, don't cry. Mommy, don't cry. Cassius watched this. He looked at the pink skin of the child who, just a minute ago, had been gray, at the mother crying with happiness, at the village standing behind them. 62 people with gray skin and 1 girl with pink skin. He took his hand off his sword. He turned to his knights and said quietly, "Lower your weapons." No one moved. He repeated it louder. "I said, lower your weapons." One knight lowered his, then a second, then 10, then 50. Not all of them, not 200, but more than half. One of the priests stepped forward. He said that Sir Cassius had no authority to overrule the cardinal's order, that a knight's duty was to obey the church, that this was sorcery and deception. Cassius looked at the priest, then at Marin, then at the diary in Claire's hands, and he said that his duty to his brother was greater than his duty to the cardinal who had killed that brother. The priest turned pale. He turned to the knights who had not lowered their weapons. There were about 60 of them. He ordered them to carry out the cardinal's will. 60 knights raised their crossbows. 140 stood with their weapons lowered. The order split in two before the gates of the cannibals' village. 60 crossbows against 140 sheathed swords. Ethan stood between the two halves of the army and knew that one wrong word would start a bloodbath. Not between the knights and the villagers, between the knights and the knights. The priest was shouting that Sir Cassius was a traitor, that he was under a spell, that the sorcerer from Loschina had bewitched him. Cassius stood motionless, his hand on his sword, not drawn, but on the sword. Ethan saw 60 crossbowmen shift their aim, from the village to Cassius, and back again. They didn't know who to shoot at. The cardinal's order said one thing, their commander said another. And standing before them was a 5-year-old girl with rosy skin and a clay horse. Ethan did the only thing he knew how to do. He turned toward the table. He picked up a bowl filled with bread and fish and carried it to the nearest crossbowman. The man aimed his weapon at Ethan's chest. Ethan didn't stop. He kept walking, step by step, the bowl in his outstretched hands. The crossbowman was young, 20, maybe 22. His hands were shaking. Ethan stopped a meter away from him. He held out the bowl. He said quietly, "You've been walking for 3 days. You're hungry. Eat. Then you can decide who to shoot." The crossbowman looked at the bowl, at the bread, at the fish. His hands trembled even more. He looked at the priest, at Cassius, at Ethan, and he lowered his crossbow. He took the bowl. Ethan returned to the table. He took a second bowl. He carried it to the second crossbowman. He too aimed his crossbow. He too was trembling. He too took the bowl. Ethan carried the bowls one after another. Sun-A stood on the roof with a bow. An arrow knocked on the string. Every time the crossbowman looked at Ethan, her fingers turned white on the string. But she didn't shoot. Arrows into the ground, only into the ground, Ethan had promised. Nora stood with Marin behind her hand on a knife. She watched as Ethan walked toward the armed men with the bowls, time and again, and every time she held her breath. Claire stood in her cassock, white among the white, the sign of the light on her chest. A living shield, a single person. Hannah stood with her hammer, quiet, not threatening, just standing there. And everyone knew that if even a single arrow flew toward Ethan, the hammer would fly in response. Of the 60 crossbowmen, 31 took a bowl, 29 did not. They stood with their weapons, watching the priest as he shouted louder and louder. Heretics, sorcerers, traitors to the faith. Ethan returned to the table. He looked at the 29 barrels pointed at him, and then a voice rang out from behind the knights' backs. A woman's voice. Cold. Familiar. Evelyn Hayes stepped out of the line of crossbowmen. She was wearing chainmail, not a cassock, chainmail, with a dagger at her belt. She was walking toward the priest. The priest saw her. He recognized her. He said that the cardinal's niece should be on the other side, that she had been sent here to spy, not to betray. Evelyn stopped in front of him. She said that she had been sent to spy. That was true, and she had spied enough. She had seen how the cook fed the cannibals with non-human flesh, how a mother learns to make broth for her daughter, how a blacksmith reforges a murderer's knife into a cook's knife, how a 5-year-old girl says the word bread for the first time in her life. She saw the village, not a nest of monsters, a village, and she saw her uncle's letters, which she found in his study before leaving. Letters in which Cardinal Walter Hayes ordered the continued delivery of the condemned to the ravine, not for punishment, to feed them, so that the curse would not weaken, so that the village would remain hungry, so that the people would remain monsters. Because as long as there are monsters, the church needs knights. And as long as knights are needed, the church holds power. 300 years, generation after generation. Evelyn pulled a scroll from her bosom. She threw it on the ground in front of the priest. The cardinal's letter, with a seal, with a signature. The priest looked down. He turned pale. Not because of the contents, because of the seal, the real one. He recognized it. Evelyn turned to Cassius. She said that her uncle had ordered the village to be burned, and for Evelyn to be burned along with it, if she didn't return, because she had seen too much and knew too much. And because the cardinal had never loved his niece, he loved only his lies. 29 crossbowmen stared at the letter on the ground, at the priest, who remained silent, at Evelyn, who stood with her back straight and her eyes wet. One by one, they lowered their weapons, not all at once, slowly. 1, then a second, then 5. 11 crossbows remained on the ground, aimed toward the village. The priest raised his hand. He shouted that it was a forgery, that the cardinal's niece was a traitor, that it was the order's duty. Cassius drew his sword. In a single motion, the blade stopped at the priest's throat. Cassius spoke softly. My brother, Arden Dorn, 22 years old, accused of heresy, sent to the glade, eaten, not by cannibals, by the church. The priest fell silent. 11 crossbowmen lowered their weapons. They were the last to do so. Ethan exhaled. The panel flashed. Sir Cassius Dorn's trust went from 0 to 14. Public reputation, plus 3 levels. Status, recognized by the regional authorities. The Order of Ash did not burn Mossy Hollow. 200 knights stood before the cannibals' village with their weapons lowered, and Ethan Reed stood before them with empty bowls and a blacksmith's knife in his hand. Cassius approached him, looked him in the eyes, asked quietly, His brother, he's here. His body. Bourne stepped forward. He said that Arden Dorn had been buried, not eaten, buried. He died from the curse on the 3rd day, like all the new ones. But they hadn't touched him. Bourne would show him the grave if Sir Cassius wished. Cassius nodded, once, briefly, and he turned away. Ethan saw a single tear roll down his cheek. Just one, like Sunna's that morning with the mushrooms. The Knights of the Order of Ash spent the night by the walls of Mossy Hollow. They ate bread and smoked fish from bowls the cook had made. Some talked with the locals, quietly, carefully, the way people talk to those they've feared their whole lives and now don't know what to say. In the morning, Cassius mustered the order and led them back, not to the Hollow, to the capital, to the Cardinal, with Claire's diary, with Evelyn's letter, with the testimonies of 63 witnesses and 1 5-year-old girl with pink skin. A year had passed. Ethan stood in Mossy Hollow Square and didn't recognize it. The moss on the walls was still there. He decided that the moss was part of its character, but everything else had changed. The 12 huts had become 20. Wren had been building non-stop. Every house had a door, a real door, on hinges forged by Hannah. Every house had a window, not a hole in the wall, a window with a frame and shutters. The village had a street, with a path made of flat stones that Gray had laid over the course of 3 months. He gave 248 stones to Fira, The 249th became the first stone of the path. In the center of the village stood a furnace, not the first one made of stone and clay, a new one, a large one, with 3 levels, with a copper pipe that Hannah had forged from metal given to her by the merchants. The merchants came of their own accord, after the trial of Baron Morvet. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Cassius Dorn personally presented the evidence: Claire's diary, Evelyn's letters, testimony from the residents of the ravine, testimony from 30 knights of the order who had witnessed the lifting of the curse from Marin with their own eyes. The Baron was stripped of his title and lands. His estate was confiscated. He himself was imprisoned in the very same cage in which the condemned were transported to the ravine. Ethan was not present at the trial. He was preparing. He had no time for trials. He had 62 people under the curse, and every day each plate lifted 1 drop. Cardinal Hayes fled on the night of Morvet's arrest. They searched for him for 4 months. They found him in the basement of an abandoned monastery on the border with a neighboring kingdom. He had the treaty with him, that very one, the 300-year-old one, signed between the Church of Light and the deity of hunger. Hannah read it aloud in the capital square, in the ancient language that only she knew. Then Claire translated it. The treaty stated, "The Church of Light cedes 1 village to the deity of hunger. In return, the deity will not touch the rest of the kingdom. Term, eternity. Condition for termination: if a descendant of the one who refused to sign the treaty returns and feeds the damned with that which is not flesh. If trust outweighs fear. If every single name is spoken, the contract is terminated." Ethan read these lines and his hands trembled. A descendant of the one who refused to sign. His grandmother, a missionary of the Church of Light. 300 years ago, according to local time, she refused to sign. For this, she was erased from the chronicles, exiled. But her blood remained. It passed through generations, through worlds, through death, and returned in the body of a young man from Portland who knew how to do only one thing: cook in a way that made people feel at home. The hearth system was no random reward. It was his grandmother's unfinished skill. For 300 years he had waited for a blood heir. Ethan wasn't a stranger. He was a returnee. The cardinal's trial lasted a month. Evelyn testified as the main witness. She stood before the courtroom and spoke in an even voice, without tears, without a tremor. She recounted the executions her uncle had taken her to as a child, the letters in which he ordered her to feed the curse. About 300 years of lies. Cardinal Walter Hayes was defrocked. His order was dissolved. The Church of Light issued a public act of repentance for the first time in its history. 6 months after the Battle of the Ravine, Ethan stood before the King of Orleans, not on his knees, standing, wearing Hannah's apron, with the Breckenridge knife at his belt. The king was old, weary. He knew about Loshchina. He had always known, just as his father had, and his father's father. For 300 years, the royal family had turned a blind eye. Ethan didn't blame him. He prepared a plate for him. The panel displayed the recipe for King Orleans: turnip soup with caraway and butter, a dish from his childhood, from the days when he was a prince and his mother used to cook his dinner herself, before the coronation, before he learned about the ravine, before he learned to look away. The king ate in silence. When the plate was empty, he looked up. His eyes were red. He asked what Ethan wanted. Ethan said 3 things: the complete lifting of the curse from all the residents of Loshchina, free citizen status for everyone, and permission to build a restaurant in the capital. The king asked what kind of restaurant. Ethan said, 12 tables. The menu changes every day, tailored to each guest. It's called Home Plate. The king signed all 3 decrees. Ethan returned to Loshchina with the decrees and a sack of salt, real salt, 10 kilograms. Hannah said he could have asked the king for gold. Ethan said you can't season broth with gold. Hannah laughed so hard that roof tiles, the ones Wren had laid last week, rained down from the hut's roof. Lifting the curse took another 3 months. Every day, every plate, every name. The display showed the numbers. 70%, 55, 40, 28, 15, 7, 3, 0. One by one, the residents of the hollow shed their gray skin. They became ordinary people, with ordinary skin, with ordinary teeth, with ordinary hunger. Born was the last. 61 years of the curse. His body resisted longer than anyone else's. Ethan cooked for him every day, a personal plate, with his name on the bowl, with angelica broth, just like his mother used to make. On the day Bourne's curse was lifted, the old man stepped out into the square. He looked at his hands, pink, without black nails, without gray skin. He looked up at the sky and said that for the first time in 61 years, he didn't want to eat any of the people present. Everyone laughed. Bourne, too. It took 4 months to build the restaurant in the capital. Wren did the design. Gray carried the stones. Hannah forged the hinges, handles, hooks, and the frame for the sign. Fira sewed the tablecloths. From real fabric, not from deer hide. Claire wrote the menu, by hand, in the beautiful handwriting she'd been taught at the convent. Sona brought flowers. She silently placed the pot on the windowsill and left. Ethan found her on the roof of the neighboring house, with an onion on her lap, looking out at the city. He sat down beside her, silently. She said the city was big. Ethan agreed. She said she didn't know how to live in a big city. Ethan said he didn't know either when he moved from his grandmother's diner to Portland. But he figured it out. She'll figure it out. Sana looked at him. For the first time ever, she looked him in the eyes. And she said that if he died, she'd die right after him. Not because she was romantic, but because she'd have no one left to protect. Ethan said he had no plans to die. He had too many orders. Sana almost smiled. Almost. The Home Plate restaurant opened on the first day of spring. 12 tables. The menu changes every day, tailored to each guest. Nora and Marin sat at the first table. Marin was 6. She went to school, a real school in the capital. She could count to 100, and read, and write. And she still made figures out of dough, little horses, only now they had 4 legs. Bourne sat at the second table. He ordered angelica broth, just like every day. Ethan prepared it differently every day. Every day, Bourne said that today's was better than yesterday's. Gray and Fira were sitting at the third table, side by side, his hand on hers. Her fingernails weren't black. They were ordinary, with paint underneath them. Fira dyed fabrics. It was her new business. At the fourth table was Hannah, with a hammer under her chair. She never parted with it. She'd opened a blacksmith shop across the street from the restaurant. She forged knives, chef's knives, only chef's knives, nothing else ever again. At the fifth table was Claire, with a book. She always had a book with her. She was writing the history of Mossy Hollow, the real one. No lies, no omissions, all the names, all the dates. All 800 people consigned to damnation over 300 years. Every name, every fate. At the sixth table sat Son A, alone, with a cup of tea. She didn't like company, but she came every day. She sat by the window, she drank tea, she looked out at the street, and then she left. Sometimes she left a flower on the table, without a word. At the seventh table sat Evelyn Hayes, a former spy, the former niece of an inquisitor, now just Evelyn. She worked in the royal archives, sifting through church documents, 3 centuries of lies. She came to the restaurant in the evening. She ordered turnip soup with caraway. Every time. And every time she closed her eyes for a second when she took her first sip. At the eighth table sat a man Ethan hadn't expected, Sir Cassius Dorn. He came without armor, in plain clothes. He sat down. He looked at the menu. He looked at Ethan, and asked for what his brother Arden used to eat as a child. Ethan didn't know that recipe. The panel didn't know it. Cassius described it. Oatmeal with honey and apples. Their mother used to cook it for both of them every morning, before Arden was taken away. Ethan made it. Cassius ate in silence. Then he stood up, placed a coin on the table, and left. He came every week, always ordered the same thing, always left a single coin, never spoke. Ethan didn't press him. Some people don't need words. I need a plate. The 4 remaining tables were empty. No, not empty, reserved. Each had a sign on it, handwritten by Claire. For those we fed, and for those who fed us. Once, an old man from a village near the border sat down at one of these tables. His grandfather had been among those eaten in Loschina 40 years ago. He came because he'd heard about the restaurant, about the chef, about the former cannibals who work here. He sat down at the table. Nora brought him a plate. She worked as a waitress. Ethan had trained her. She set plates in front of people, and every time she did, she remembered how 3 years ago she had set a very different plate in front of her daughter. And every time she set this plate more carefully, more gently, like an apology that never ends. The old man ate his soup. Nora stood nearby. He looked up. He looked at her. She looked at him. He knew who she was. She knew who he was. A descendant of those who were eaten and a descendant of those who did the eating, at the same table, in the same restaurant. And the soup was hot and delicious, and that was the only thing that mattered at that moment. That evening, Ethan stood in the kitchen. The restaurant had closed. The dishes were washed. The tables were wiped down. Nora had put Marin to bed. Hannah had gone to the blacksmith shop. Claire was writing by candlelight. Son A was sitting on the roof, as always. Ethan stood alone, wearing Hannah's apron, with the Breckenridge knife in his hand. The panel flashed one last time. General Trust, 10,000. The Curse of Mossy Hollow, 0%. All residents are free. The Hearth System, complete. Grandma's Skill, completed. The panel went dark, forever. Ethan stood in silence. No numbers, no prompts. No list of names for the morning. Just a cook in his restaurant, with a knife that once killed and now feeds. He hung his apron on a hook, set the knife on the counter, stepped outside. The sky over the Capitol was clear and dark and full of stars. He sat down on the threshold. Nora came out a minute later. She sat down next to him. She rested her head on his shoulder, in silence. Somewhere in the city, Hannah was hammering away. Somewhere, Claire was scratching away with her pen. Somewhere, Son A was pulling back the bowstring simply because she didn't know how to do it any other way. Somewhere, Marin was sleeping under a blanket that Fira had knitted, and she was dreaming of bread. Ethan closed his eyes. For the first time in a year, he wasn't thinking about numbers. He wasn't counting plates. He wasn't estimating how much salt was left. He was just sitting there, on the threshold of his restaurant, next to the woman who had once held a knife to his throat. And he felt good. Just good.